My son said the family trip wasn't meant for him. 3 days later, he learned why that was a mistake. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. Not late. Not urgent. Just ordinary enough to be dangerous. The kind of call people remember for years because of how normal everything felt right before it happened. My friend Harold Bennett was sitting on the back porch when it came. He was 72 years old. Retired. Widowed. The sort of man who fixed things instead of replacing them. If a fence leaned, he straightened it. If a chair broke, he repaired it. If life got difficult, he quietly kept moving. Harold lived alone on 12 acres outside Bloomington, Indiana. The property wasn't impressive. At least not at first glance. There was an old farmhouse. A weathered barn. A fishing pond behind the trees. And a gravel road that had more potholes than pavement. Most people saw an aging farmer. What they didn't see was a man who had spent 40 years building a successful agricultural supply business. The sort of man who could have lived anywhere. But chose to stay where his memories were. 3 years earlier, Harold had buried his wife, Diane. 50 years of marriage. Gone in a single afternoon. Since then, his world had become smaller. Not lonely. Just smaller. His son, Mark, lived 2 hours away. His daughter, Susan, lived in Ohio. The grandchildren were growing up faster than he liked. Life moved on. It always does. That Thursday afternoon, Harold had been repairing a loose board on the porch. A simple job. The kind of task that lets a man think. His phone buzzed. The screen showed his son's name. Mark rarely called during working hours. Harold smiled. He thought maybe his son wanted advice. Or maybe one of the grandchildren wanted to visit. Instead, the first thing he heard was, "Dad, I need to talk to you about the lake trip." Harold set down his hammer. Every summer, the entire family gathered for a long weekend at a lakeside resort in northern Michigan. It had become a tradition. One Harold paid for. Not because anyone asked him to. Because he enjoyed seeing everyone together. For 4 days every year, the family felt like a family again. "What's wrong with the trip?" Harold asked. There was a pause. A long one. Then Mark cleared his throat. "Dad. Karen thinks it might be better if you sit this one out." Harold thought he had misheard. Sit it out? Just this year. The words sounded strange. Like they belonged to somebody else's conversation. Harold laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes confusion sounds a lot like laughter. Why would I sit it out? Another pause. Then came the explanation. Karen wanted a more relaxed atmosphere. Karen thought some family conversations would be easier. Karen thought everyone needed space. Karen. 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 Harold noticed something. His son never once said, "I think." Only, "Karen thinks." The older you get, the more you learn to listen to what people don't say. Harold stared across the property. The pond reflected the afternoon sun. A pair of geese floated near the far bank. Everything looked peaceful. But something wasn't right. Because the trip wasn't Karen's tradition. It wasn't Mark's tradition. It wasn't anyone else's. It was Harold's. He had organized it. He had paid for it. He had maintained it for nearly 15 years. And somehow he was the one being excluded. "Dad, please don't make this difficult." Those words hurt more than the exclusion itself. Because Harold hadn't argued. Hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't objected. Yet somehow he had already become the problem. When the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time. Then he walked inside. On the kitchen counter sat an envelope. A simple white envelope. It had arrived in the mail earlier that morning. He hadn't opened it yet. At the time, it seemed unimportant. A routine piece of paperwork. Nothing more. But after that phone call, something made him pick it up. Inside was a copy of a property assessment request. His property assessment request. Submitted 3 weeks earlier. Except Harold had never submitted one. And somebody else's signature appeared where his should have been. That was the moment everything changed. Because suddenly, this wasn't about a family trip anymore. And what Harold discovered over the following weeks would force him to question whether the people he trusted most had been planning something behind his back all along. Hello, my friends. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 67 years old, retired, widowed, and living in a quiet little town outside Indianapolis. When Harold first told me this story over coffee one rainy afternoon, I thought it would be another sad story about family disagreements. I was wrong. Because by the time this story was over, the family trip would turn out to be the least important part of it. And the small white envelope sitting on Harold's kitchen counter would reveal a secret nobody saw coming. Harold didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was frightened. Because he was confused. There is a difference. Fear makes your heart race. Confusion makes your mind refuse to stop working. The property assessment request sat on the kitchen table beside a half-empty cup of coffee. Harold read it again before going to bed. Then again before sunrise. The document was real. The county seal was real. The filing date was real. Only one thing wasn't. His signature. For nearly 40 years, Harold had signed contracts, loan agreements, tax documents, and business records. He knew his own handwriting. This wasn't it. At first, he tried to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe someone submitted the wrong form. Maybe there was an explanation. By mid-morning, he drove into town. The county office occupied an old brick building across from the courthouse. The same building Harold had visited dozens of times over the years. The woman behind the counter recognized him immediately. Small towns are like that. Morning, Harold. Morning. He handed her the paperwork. I have a question. 20 minutes later, he left with more questions than answers. The assessment request had been filed properly. The supporting documents had been accepted. And according to the records, the application package included identification documents. Copies of identification documents. His identification documents. Harold felt a strange pressure in his chest. Not panic. Something colder. Something quieter. The feeling a man gets when he realizes a door has been opened without his permission. Outside, he sat in his truck for several minutes. The engine idled. People walked past. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Yet Harold couldn't stop thinking about one detail. The filing date. 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks earlier happened to be the same weekend Mark and Karen had visited unexpectedly. The same weekend Karen spent nearly an hour inside the house while everyone else sat outside on the porch. At the time, Harold hadn't thought much about it. Now he remembered. She had asked where he kept old property records. She had asked where important documents were stored. She had asked several questions that seemed harmless. At the time. Now they didn't seem harmless anymore. When he returned home, he walked straight into his office. The room smelled faintly of old paper and motor oil. A combination Diane used to complain about every spring. A metal filing cabinet stood against the wall. Harold opened it. Everything appeared normal. Tax records. Insurance papers. Land surveys. Business documents. Nothing looked disturbed. Then he noticed a folder slightly out of place. Only an inch. Maybe less. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Harold did. Years in business had taught him something simple. People can fake confidence. They can fake honesty. They can even fake affection. But they rarely put things back exactly where they found them. Inside the folder was a copy of his property deed. The original wasn't there. Harold checked again. Then a third time. The original deed was gone. For the first time since Diane's funeral, Harold felt genuinely uneasy. Not because of the missing document. Because of what it meant. Someone had been preparing. Planning. Taking steps. And nobody prepares that carefully for something innocent. That evening, his daughter Susan called. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. She sounded nervous. Distracted. Like someone trying to finish a conversation before saying the wrong thing. Then she asked a question. A simple question. The kind that shouldn't matter. "Dad, have you decided what you're doing with the property?" Harold looked out the window. The barn stood quietly beneath the setting sun. The pond reflected the orange sky. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow everything felt different. "What do you mean?" he asked. Another pause. Too many pauses lately. "Oh, nothing. Just curious. Just curious." Those 2 words bothered him all night. Because people are rarely curious about property unless property is already being discussed somewhere else. And Harold was beginning to suspect those discussions were happening without him. The next morning brought another surprise. A letter from his bank. Not unusual. Banks send letters all the time. But this one wasn't routine. According to the letter, a recent inquiry had been made regarding a potential home equity credit application. An inquiry connected to his property. Harold read the letter twice. Then a third time. He had never applied for a home equity line of credit. Never requested information. Never authorized anyone to act on his behalf. The pieces still didn't fit together. But they were beginning to form a picture. And Harold was starting to realize something. The family trip wasn't the problem. The family trip was a distraction. The real story had started long before that phone call. And whatever was happening behind the scenes was much bigger than hurt feelings. Much bigger than family drama. Someone wanted something. And for the first time, Harold intended to find out exactly what it was. Harold spent the next 2 days doing something most people would consider boring. He paid attention. No accusations. No confrontations. No angry phone calls. Just observation. At 72, he had learned an important lesson. When something doesn't make sense, the worst thing you can do is announce that you've noticed. People become careful. Evidence disappears. Stories change. So Harold acted exactly the same. He called his son on Saturday morning. He asked about the grandchildren. He asked about baseball. He asked about the weather. Nothing more. Mark sounded relieved. Almost too relieved. As if he had expected a different conversation. That told Harold something. His son knew there was a reason to be nervous. By Sunday afternoon, Harold drove to the bank. Not because he wanted answers. Because he wanted records. There is a difference. Answers come from people. Records come from systems. And systems lie less often. The branch manager knew him well. Harold had banked there for over 30 years. They sat in a small office overlooking the parking lot. For the first 15 minutes, everything seemed normal. Then the manager opened a file. And Harold noticed the expression on her face change. Not dramatically. Just enough. A slight pause. A slight tightening around the eyes. The kind of reaction people have when they realize they may have said too much. "Is there a problem?" Harold asked. The manager hesitated. Then she turned the screen slightly. "Mr. Bennett, I assumed you were already aware." Aware of what? That question never left Harold's mind afterward. Because what appeared on the screen wasn't an application. It wasn't a loan. It wasn't an approval. It was an inquiry log. Several inquiries. all connected to his property. His assets. His estate planning profile. His long-term accounts. The first inquiry had occurred 6 weeks earlier. The second came 4 weeks later. The third happened only 8 days ago. Harold stared at the dates. Then he noticed something else. Each inquiry referenced a possible future representative. A person who might eventually act on his behalf. His stomach tightened. Who requested these? The manager shook her head. I can't discuss certain details without a formal review. That answer told him more than a direct answer ever could. Because if there was nothing wrong, there would be nothing to hide. When he returned home, Harold sat at the kitchen table until dark. The old clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily. Outside, the wind pushed against the trees. Inside, the house felt unusually quiet. Then he remembered something. A conversation from months earlier. At the time, it seemed harmless. Karen had asked an odd question during Thanksgiving dinner. What happens if someone becomes unable to manage their finances? Everyone had treated it like casual conversation. One of those hypothetical discussions families have around the table. Harold remembered answering. Then he remembered Karen asking follow-up questions. Lots of follow-up questions. Power of attorney. Estate management. Asset protection. At the time, she had smiled. Everyone had smiled. Now the memory felt different. Much different. By Monday morning, Harold had stopped asking whether something was happening. He already knew something was happening. The real question was, how far had it gone? That afternoon, another surprise arrived. A phone call. This time from an attorney's office. A firm Harold had never contacted. The receptionist sounded confused. Polite. Professional. But confused. She explained that someone had recently called regarding documentation connected to Harold Bennett. His estate. His future care planning. His legal representation. The caller had apparently claimed to be helping coordinate family matters. Family matters. Harold wrote the phrase down. Then circled it. People hide behind words like that. Family matters. Best interests. Future planning. Support. The words sound kind. The intentions behind them aren't always kind. When the call ended, Harold walked outside. The sun was beginning to set. The pond reflected orange and gold across the water. For a moment, everything looked peaceful again. Then he noticed tire tracks near the side of the barn. Fresh tire tracks. Not his truck. Not a delivery vehicle. Someone had been on the property recently. Very recently. Harold followed them on foot. The tracks ended near a small storage building. The same storage building where he kept old business records. And standing there, looking at the padlock, Harold felt something he hadn't felt since opening that white envelope. Not fear. Not anger. Certainty. Because piece by piece, the puzzle was starting to come together. And the picture it was forming was far worse than being excluded from a family trip. Someone wasn't trying to hurt his feelings. Someone was trying to position themselves for something much bigger. Something involving his property. His finances. And possibly his future itself. For the first time, Harold stopped wondering if there was a plan. There was. The only thing he didn't know yet was who was truly behind it. The next morning, Harold unlocked the storage building. The padlock clicked open with the same sound it had made for years. Ordinary. Familiar. Comforting. But nothing about that morning felt ordinary. The building sat behind the barn, partially hidden by a line of maple trees. Most people would have ignored it. Inside were decades of records. Old business files. Tax returns. Property surveys. Boxes Harold hadn't opened in years. When Diane was alive, She used to joke that he kept enough paperwork to survive 3 audits and the end of civilization. Harold smiled when he thought about that. Then the smile faded. Because somebody had been here. He was sure of it. The dust told him. People think dust is useless. It isn't. Dust remembers. Dust records movement. Dust reveals patterns. And Harold noticed patterns. A shelf near the back had been disturbed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A faint rectangular outline showed where a box had been removed and returned. The surrounding dust was untouched. The box wasn't. Harold carefully lifted it down. Inside were old estate records. Property deeds. Business contracts. Family trust documents. Nothing appeared missing. At least not immediately. But one file folder looked newer than the others. Much newer. The label read, Family Asset Summary. Harold frowned. He had never created a folder with that name. He opened it. The first page wasn't alarming. A simple list of assets. Property values. Investment accounts. Retirement funds. Insurance information. The sort of information financial advisors prepare. The sort of information families discuss after a death. Then he reached the second page. And stopped. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Not his handwriting. Not Diane's. Someone had written. Primary concern equals control structure after transition. Harold read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Transition. An interesting word. People rarely say. After Harold dies. They say. After transition. People rarely say. When Harold can no longer make decisions. They say. Future planning. The older Harold became, the more he noticed how often uncomfortable truths hid behind comfortable words. He sat quietly in the storage building. Listening to the wind outside. Thinking. Then he saw another page. This one contained a list of names. Mark. Karen. Susan. Several names he recognized. A few he didn't. Beside some names were question marks. Beside others were percentages. No explanation. No title. No context. Just names and numbers. Harold felt the first genuine surge of anger since this entire situation began. Not because of the money. The money didn't bother him. What bothered him was something else. Nobody had asked him. Not once. People were apparently discussing his future. Calculating his future. Organizing his future. Without involving the one person whose future it actually was. By noon, Harold drove into town again. This time he wasn't looking for paperwork. He was looking for perspective. For 30 years, he had breakfast every Wednesday with the same group of men. Retired farmers. Retired contractors. Retired business owners. The unofficial town council, as Diane used to call them. They met at a diner on Main Street. The coffee was average. The opinions were not. Harold arrived late. His friend Walter Simmons noticed immediately. Something bothering you? Harold considered lying. Instead, he told a shortened version of the truth. Not everything. Just enough. The table became unusually quiet. Eventually Walter leaned back in his chair. Walter was 80 years old. A former banker. The sort of man who listened carefully before speaking. When he finally spoke, every person at the table listened. You know what concerns me? Harold shook his head. The property assessment doesn't concern me. What does? The timing. Harold said nothing. Walter continued. People don't start gathering information after they make a decision. He stirred his coffee. They gather information before they make a decision. The sentence stayed with Harold long after breakfast ended. Because it felt true. Painfully true. Everything he had found so far pointed in one direction. Preparation. 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 Nobody had acted yet. But somebody was preparing to act. That evening, Harold reviewed everything again. The assessment request. The bank inquiry. The attorney's office. The mysterious file folder. The names. The percentages. The missing deed. Each item alone could be explained. Together they formed a pattern. And patterns were harder to ignore. Around 8 o'clock, his phone rang. Susan. His daughter. Again. This time she sounded nervous from the first word. Dad, are you okay? A strange question. Especially from someone who almost never asked it. I'm fine. Another pause. Always the pauses. They were becoming as revealing as the conversations themselves. Then Susan said something unexpected. Has anyone talked to you about estate planning recently? Harold sat perfectly still. The room suddenly felt smaller. What do you mean? I don't know. She sounded uncertain. Guilty, almost. I just heard some conversations. What conversations? Susan hesitated. Too long. Then she changed direction. Never mind. But Harold didn't let it go. Who was talking? Another silence. Longer this time. Finally she sighed. Dad, I think you should be careful. The line went quiet. Then she quickly said goodbye and ended the call. Harold stared at the phone. For several seconds, he didn't move. Because Susan had just confirmed something important. She knew something. Maybe not everything. But enough to be worried. Enough to call. Enough to warn him. And for the first time since this all began, Harold realized he might not be dealing with a single plan. He might be dealing with multiple people. Some involved. Some uncomfortable. Some trying to help. Some trying to stay out of it. The situation had become far more complicated than he originally believed. And somewhere inside that growing web of secrets, one question continued to haunt him. What exactly had his son and daughter-in-law been preparing for all these months? Whatever the answer was, Harold could feel himself getting closer. And usually, when people get closer to the truth, the people hiding it start making mistakes. Harold spent the next week pretending nothing had changed. That was easier said than done. Every phone call sounded different now. Every casual conversation felt loaded. Every question carried a second meaning. The hardest part wasn't the uncertainty. It was acting as if he didn't notice it. Mark called twice. Both conversations were unusually short. His son sounded distracted. Rushed. Like a man trying to manage too many moving parts at once. The old Harold might have ignored it. The new Harold listened carefully. People reveal themselves when they're under pressure. By Friday afternoon, another piece of the puzzle arrived. Completely by accident. At least that's what it looked like. Harold was sorting through old mail when a folded receipt slipped from the pages of a farm supply catalog. It wasn't his receipt. The paper was newer than everything else in the stack. Someone must have tucked it there recently. The purchase itself wasn't remarkable. A printer. Several boxes of paper. Document sleeves. File organizers. Office supplies. Hundreds of dollars worth. What caught Harold's attention was the delivery address. Not Mark's home. Not Susan's home. A small office suite in Indianapolis. The business name printed at the top meant nothing to him. But the address did. Because he had seen it before. 3 days earlier. Inside the mysterious family asset summary folder. Harold leaned back in his chair. The same address. The same location. The same unanswered questions. Coincidences exist. But multiple coincidences rarely travel together. That evening, he drove into town and met Walter Simmons again. The diner was nearly empty. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Harold showed him a copy of the receipt. Walter studied it for nearly a minute. Then he asked a simple question. Why would somebody preparing paperwork need this much equipment? Harold didn't answer. Walter continued. Unless they expected to process a lot of documents. The sentence landed heavily. Because Harold had already been thinking the same thing. One form could be explained. Two forms could be explained. But someone appeared to be preparing for something larger. Something organized. Something ongoing. The following Monday brought another surprise. This time it came from Mark himself. His son stopped by unexpectedly. Alone. No Karen. No grandchildren. Just Mark. That alone was unusual. Mark rarely visited without a reason. And Harold could see tension in his face before he even stepped out of the truck. They sat on the porch together. For a while they talked about nothing. The weather. Football. A neighbor selling land. Then Mark looked toward the pond. Dad. The word hung in the air. Harold waited. Have you ever thought about simplifying things? There it was. Not a direct question. A test. The kind people ask when they're trying to discover what you know. What things? The property. Harold kept his expression neutral. The property seems complicated. Complicated. Another interesting word. The farm had been managed successfully for decades. The taxes were current. The records were organized. The business had been closed properly years ago. Nothing about it was complicated. Except perhaps ownership. Mark continued. Sometimes people our age should make things easier. Our age. Harold almost smiled. His son was 46. They were not the same age. Not even close. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. But Harold barely heard the words. Because he was listening for something else. What Mark wasn't saying. And by the time his son drove away, Harold had learned something important. Mark wasn't leading this. He was participating. There is a difference. Leaders push. Followers repeat. Mark kept repeating ideas. Ideas that sounded rehearsed. Ideas that sounded borrowed. Ideas that sounded like they had originated somewhere else. Later that night, Harold sat alone on the porch. The sky was clear. The stars reflected across the pond. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he had been avoiding. What if Karen wasn't the entire story? What if somebody else was advising them? Somebody with experience. Somebody who understood paperwork. Estate planning. Financial structures. Property transfers. The thought bothered him. Because families rarely invent schemes like this on their own. Someone usually points them in a direction. Someone usually explains what is possible. Someone usually benefits. The next morning, Harold received the phone call that changed everything. It came from an attorney. Not the attorney's office that had called before. A different one. The man's voice was calm. Professional. And after introducing himself, he asked a question that made Harold's blood run cold. Mr. Bennett, are you aware that a preliminary discussion has already taken place regarding your future guardianship arrangements? For several seconds, Harold couldn't speak. Guardianship. The word echoed in his mind. Not estate planning. Not inheritance. Not property. Guardianship. That wasn't about money. That was about control. And suddenly every strange conversation. Every inquiry. Every missing document. Every unexplained signature. Every warning. Every pause. Every uncomfortable phone call started forming a much darker picture. Because somebody wasn't merely planning for what would happen after Harold died. Somebody appeared to be preparing for a future where Harold was still alive, but no longer in charge of his own life. Harold ended the call and sat motionless at the kitchen table. The attorney hadn't accused anyone. Hadn't made any claims. Hadn't even sounded alarmed. In fact, the man sounded almost routine. As if conversations about guardianship happened every day. Maybe they did. Just not to Harold. Not to a man who still managed his own finances. Still drove himself everywhere. Still maintained 12 acres of property. Still remembered every birthday in the family. The attorney had only called because something didn't add up. That bothered Harold even more. Professionals don't make unnecessary phone calls. Not lawyers. Not bankers. Not people whose time is billed by the hour. Which meant someone else had already raised concerns. Real concerns. Enough concerns for a second attorney to notice inconsistencies. Enough concerns for questions to start being asked. That night, Harold barely touched his dinner. The pot roast sat untouched on the plate. Outside, the crickets filled the darkness with their usual song. Inside, the house felt different. Smaller somehow. Not because the walls had changed. Because Harold's understanding of his situation had changed. He found himself thinking about Diane. She had always been the cautious one. The one who noticed trouble early. The one who could walk into a room and sense tension before anyone spoke. 20 years ago she used to say, "Pay attention when people start making plans for you instead of with you." At the time Harold thought she was being dramatic. Now he wasn't so sure. The following morning, he made a decision. No more guessing. No more assumptions. No more waiting for answers to appear. If people were discussing his future behind closed doors, then he needed someone firmly on his side. Someone whose loyalty wasn't tied to family politics. By noon he was sitting across from Robert Callahan. Robert had been his attorney for nearly 25 years. Not a flashy lawyer. Not one of those television personalities who advertised on billboards. Just steady. Practical. Reliable. The sort of man who read every line before signing anything. Harold trusted him. More importantly, Robert trusted facts. Harold laid everything on the table. The property assessment. The missing deed. The inquiry notices. The strange phone calls. The guardianship question. The asset summary folder. The warnings from Susan. Robert listened quietly. Occasionally taking notes. Occasionally asking for dates. Never interrupting. When Harold finally finished, the office became silent. Robert folded his hands. Then asked one question. "Has anyone recently suggested that you're having memory problems?" Harold frowned. The question felt random. Until it didn't. A memory surfaced. Then another. Then another. Karen correcting him during Thanksgiving. Karen reminding people that Harold sometimes forgot things. Karen laughing about him misplacing his reading glasses. Karen telling stories about him repeating himself. At the time it all seemed harmless. Normal family teasing. Now Harold saw it differently. Not because the stories were false. Everyone misplaces glasses. Everyone repeats themselves occasionally. The problem was the pattern. The repetition. The narrative. A picture being painted one small brushstroke at a time. Robert noticed the change in Harold's expression. "You remembered something." Harold nodded slowly. Then spent 10 minutes describing those conversations. When he finished, Robert leaned back. For the first time all afternoon, the attorney looked concerned. Not shocked. Concerned. Which was somehow worse. "Harold," he said carefully, "if someone wanted to challenge your decision-making capacity, this is exactly how it would begin. The room became very quiet. Harold stared at him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Robert continued. It doesn't mean they've succeeded. Have they tried? I don't know. Can they? Robert's answer came immediately. Only if you let them get ahead of you. The sentence landed like a hammer. Because suddenly Harold understood something. The property wasn't the first target. The money wasn't the first target. Control was the first target. Everything else came afterward. If someone could convince enough people that Harold wasn't capable, then every decision he made could be questioned. Every signature. Every account. Every asset. Every choice. The realization sent a chill through him. Not because he felt powerless. Because he finally understood the battlefield. For weeks he had been looking at pieces. Documents. Calls. Questions. Now the pieces formed a picture. And the picture was ugly. Robert opened a file drawer. Removed a yellow legal pad. Then began writing a list. Medical evaluation. Financial review. Document protection. Asset freeze alerts. Fraud monitoring. Witness records. Independent assessments. One by one. Methodically. Like a man preparing for a storm he could already see approaching. Harold watched the list grow. Each item made the situation feel more real. More serious. Less like family drama. More like strategy. Then Robert asked another question. Who benefits if you're declared unable to manage your affairs? The answer appeared immediately. Mark. Karen. Possibly others. Harold didn't say the names aloud. He didn't need to. Both men already knew. As the meeting ended, Robert handed him a business card. Not his own. Another attorney. A specialist. Someone who worked almost exclusively with elder financial abuse cases. Harold slipped the card into his pocket. Then stood. For the first time in weeks, he felt something unexpected. Not relief. Not confidence. Clarity. The fog was beginning to lift. The mystery wasn't solved. Not even close. But he finally knew what kind of game was being played. And once a man understands the game, he can start preparing his own moves. What Harold didn't know yet was that the people planning against him were about to make their biggest mistake so far. A mistake that would expose far more than they intended. 3 days later, Harold received an invitation. Not a formal invitation. Not a phone call. Not even a text message. It was a photograph. One photograph. Sent by his granddaughter Emma. 15 years old. Bright. Kind. And thankfully, not yet skilled at keeping family secrets. The picture showed a large dining table inside a restaurant in Indianapolis. Harold recognized several faces immediately. Mark. Karen. Susan. Susan's husband. 2 people he didn't know. And 3 empty chairs. At first, the photograph seemed harmless. Just a family dinner. Then Harold noticed the date. It had been taken the previous weekend. The very weekend Susan claimed she had been homesick. The same weekend Mark claimed he was taking the kids to a baseball tournament. The same weekend Karen told everyone she was too busy to travel. Harold zoomed in. The timestamp was clear. The location tag was visible. Nobody knew Emma had sent it. Nobody knew Harold had seen it. For several minutes, he simply stared at the image. Not because of who was there. Because of who wasn't. Him. The realization hurt more than he expected. Not because he needed an invitation. Not because he wanted to attend. Because every person at that table had known about the meeting. Every person except him. That evening, Harold called Emma. Not to interrogate her. Just to talk. The conversation drifted from school to music to summer plans. Then Harold casually asked about the restaurant. "Oh, that?" Emma laughed. "That family meeting?" Harold remained silent. Family meeting. Interesting choice of words. Children often tell the truth without realizing it. What family meeting? The one everyone went to in Indianapolis. Another pause. Then Emma said something that made Harold's heart sink. "I thought you were there." Harold looked out the kitchen window. The pond was calm. The barn stood exactly where it always had. Everything looked normal. Nothing felt normal. "Why did you think that?" "Because everyone kept saying it was about Grandpa." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Emma continued. "They talked about you most of the night." Harold closed his eyes. Not from anger. From disappointment. Deep disappointment. The kind that settles into a person's bones. "What did they say?" "I don't really know." She sounded uncertain. "Boring grown-up stuff." Then she hesitated. "Although." Harold waited. "There was one weird thing." "What was that?" "They kept arguing." Now Harold sat forward. "Arguing about what?" "I don't know." Another pause. Mom and Aunt Susan got upset. That surprised him. Susan had seemed nervous for weeks. Maybe now he understood why. "What happened?" Emma lowered her voice. "Grandma Karen got mad." Harold frowned. Grandma Karen. That was how the younger children referred to Karen's mother. One of the unfamiliar people at the table. Then everybody started talking at once. Harold felt his pulse quicken. Not because he had answers. Because for the first time, he had evidence of disagreement. Until now he had imagined a united front. A perfect plan. A coordinated effort. Maybe that wasn't true. Maybe cracks were already forming. After ending the call, Harold sat alone for nearly an hour. Thinking. Reviewing. Connecting pieces. Then another memory surfaced. Months ago, Susan had called unexpectedly. She wanted to know where certain family records were stored. At the time she claimed she was helping organize family history documents. A harmless request. Now Harold wasn't so sure. The next morning, he drove to Susan's house. Without calling first. Without warning. The drive took almost 2 hours. Long enough to think. Long enough to reconsider. Long enough to turn around. He never did. When Susan opened the door, the expression on her face told him everything. Shock. Fear. Guilt. Not the reaction of someone surprised by a visit. The reaction of someone surprised by a specific visitor. "Dad? Can we talk?" She immediately looked over her shoulder. Toward the hallway. Toward the kitchen. Toward something inside the house. Or someone. Then she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. That movement didn't escape Harold. People only move conversations outdoors when they don't want someone inside hearing them. For several seconds neither spoke. Finally Susan sighed. A tired sigh. The sort of sigh people release when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Dad." Her eyes filled with tears. Real tears. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just exhausted. Then she said the sentence Harold had been waiting weeks to hear. "You don't know everything that's been happening." Harold looked at his daughter. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt he was standing near the truth. Not at the truth. Near it. And whatever Susan was about to tell him was going to change everything he thought he understood about his own family. Harold didn't speak. He simply waited. Over the years, he had learned something about difficult conversations. The first person who rushes to fill the silence usually learns less. So he waited. Susan looked down at the driveway. then toward the road. Anywhere except at him. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Dad, I never wanted any of this." Harold said nothing. "I mean it. I know." The word surprised her. For the first time, she looked directly at him. "You do?" Harold nodded. Because he did. Susan had always been different from Mark. As children, Mark charged forward. Susan hesitated. Mark made decisions. Susan questioned them. Mark wanted results. Susan worried about consequences. The same pattern seemed to be playing out now. "What happened?" Harold asked quietly. Susan swallowed. Then she began. At first, after Diane passed away, everyone was genuinely concerned. At least that's how it started. Mark worried about Harold living alone. Karen worried about the farm. The grandchildren worried about loneliness. None of that was unusual. None of that was wrong. The problem came later. When concern slowly turned into planning. And planning slowly turned into assumptions. Harold listened carefully. Not interrupting. Not judging. Just listening. Susan explained that several months earlier, Karen's mother had begun asking questions. Lots of questions. Questions about the property. Questions about inheritance. Questions about long-term care. Questions about what would happen if Harold became sick. At first everyone treated it as harmless conversation. Then the conversations became more frequent. More detailed. More specific. Eventually people stopped asking what might happen. And started discussing what should happen. That was the moment things changed. Susan admitted she felt uncomfortable almost immediately. But Mark didn't. Mark believed he was being practical. Responsible. Prepared. The way many people convince themselves they're doing the right thing. Even when they're drifting somewhere dangerous. "What about the meeting in Indianapolis?" Harold asked. Susan looked away again. It wasn't the first one. Harold felt his chest tighten. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But enough. There were others? She nodded. Several. The earliest had taken place almost 4 months ago. Long before the family trip became an issue. Long before the property assessment. Long before any of the strange paperwork appeared. That detail hit Harold harder than anything else. Because it meant one thing. The family trip hadn't started the problem. The family trip had exposed it. Everything had already been moving long before then. For a moment, neither spoke. The afternoon breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Life continued as normal. Yet Harold felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Then Susan said something unexpected. "It got bigger than I thought it would." Harold frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. Again. Always the hesitation. Then she answered. "At first it was just discussions. Then people started bringing in professionals." That word caught Harold's attention immediately. Professionals. Not family. Not relatives. Professionals. Who? Susan shook her head. "I don't know all of them." But she knew enough. Financial advisors. Estate planners. Consultants. People offering suggestions. Strategies. Options. The kinds of people who viewed a family situation through spreadsheets instead of relationships. Harold remembered the mysterious names in the asset summary folder. The unknown faces at the restaurant. Suddenly they made more sense. Not complete sense. But more. Then Susan revealed something that stopped him cold. Karen wasn't the one who started it. For several seconds, Harold simply stared at her. Because for weeks he had built a picture in his mind. Karen stood at the center. Karen drove the conversations. Karen pushed the agenda. Karen created the pressure. Now that picture was cracking. If not Karen, then who? Susan looked genuinely afraid to answer. Not nervous. Afraid. The distinction mattered. People become nervous when they might upset someone. People become afraid when they might expose someone. Dad. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. There are things I don't fully understand either. Not the answer Harold wanted. But it was probably the truth. Then she added. Mark trusts the wrong people. That sentence lingered in the air. Because it felt important. Not specific. Important. Harold had known his son his entire life. Mark wasn't greedy. Not originally. Mark wasn't cruel. Not originally. But Mark had always possessed one weakness. He trusted confidence. People who sounded certain. People who spoke like experts. People who claimed to have solutions. Sometimes that quality helped him. Sometimes it hurt him. Maybe it was hurting him now. As the conversation continued, Susan finally admitted why she had called weeks earlier. The warning. The nervous questions. The hesitation. She had been trying to tell him something without becoming the target herself. Because the moment she openly disagreed, the meetings changed. People stopped sharing information. Stopped including her. Stopped trusting her. That told Harold another important thing. There were factions now. Not one side. Several. Some pushing forward. Some questioning. Some remaining silent. And silence, Harold knew, was often where the real danger lived. Eventually the conversation ended. Not because they had finished. Because both of them were exhausted. Before returning inside, Susan touched his arm. A small gesture. One she hadn't made since Diane's funeral. Then she said, Dad, please be careful. Harold nodded. But as he walked back toward his truck, he realized something. For the first time since this began, he wasn't trying to figure out whether there was a plan. There was. He wasn't trying to figure out whether people were hiding things. They were. The question had changed. Now he needed to discover who stood to gain the most. Because somewhere behind the meetings. Behind the paperwork. Behind the advice. Behind the family arguments. Someone had a destination in mind. And Harold was beginning to suspect it wasn't just about his property. It was about control over everything that would come after him. What he didn't know yet was that within 48 hours, a single email would expose the first concrete piece of evidence he had been searching for all along. 48 hours later, Harold was sitting in his office when the email arrived. At first, he almost deleted it. The sender's name meant nothing to him. The subject line was vague. No greeting. No explanation. Just 3 words. Thought you should know. Harold stared at the screen. Spam usually tries too hard. This didn't. Curiosity got the better of him. He opened it. Inside was a single attachment. A screenshot. Nothing more. No message. No signature. No request. Just a screenshot. Harold clicked it. The image filled the screen. And for several seconds, he didn't understand what he was looking at. It appeared to be part of an email chain. Several messages. Several names. Some familiar. Some not. Then he saw Mark's name. Immediately followed by Karen's. His pulse quickened. The screenshot was incomplete. Only part of the conversation was visible. But one sentence stood out. A sentence highlighted in yellow. If Harold agrees voluntarily, everything becomes much easier. Harold read it twice. Then a third time. Not because the sentence was complicated. Because it wasn't. Voluntarily. The word bothered him. People don't discuss voluntary cooperation unless they're already considering involuntary alternatives. That much he knew. The email chain continued below. Most of it was cut off. Only fragments remained visible. Timing is important. Before he changes anything. Current structure still favorable. Need everyone aligned. Harold felt the same cold sensation he had experienced when he first saw the forged property assessment. Not panic. Recognition. The recognition that another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. He printed the screenshot immediately. Then placed it beside the other documents. The white envelope. The inquiry notices. The attorney notes. The asset summary. The missing deed report. Piece by piece. The pile was growing. That afternoon, Harold drove to Robert Callahan's office. The attorney studied the screenshot carefully. Longer than Harold expected. Finally he looked up. Where did this come from? I don't know. That answer didn't seem to surprise him. Robert tapped the highlighted sentence. This is interesting. Why? Because whoever wrote this wasn't talking about inheritance. Harold waited. Robert continued. Inheritance happens after death. His finger remained on the page. This conversation is discussing influence over a living person. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because it confirmed what Harold had slowly begun to suspect. The real battle wasn't over who received assets someday. The real battle was about who controlled decisions today. As the meeting continued, Robert pointed out something Harold had missed. A timestamp. Small. Easy to overlook. The email chain was dated almost 2 months before the family trip discussion. 2 months. Harold leaned back in his chair. Again the same pattern. The same realization. The family trip wasn't the beginning. It wasn't even close. Something had already been developing for months. Perhaps longer. Then Robert asked a question. Who knew enough about your affairs to discuss structures and timing? Harold immediately thought of Mark. Then Karen. Then stopped. Because the language didn't sound like either of them. Not really. Mark wasn't that formal. Karen wasn't that technical. Whoever wrote those messages sounded experienced. Comfortable discussing control structures. Estate planning. Decision authority. The kind of language professionals use. Or people who spend a lot of time around professionals. As Harold drove home that evening, the sun was setting over the fields. Normally he loved that drive. The rolling farmland. The open sky. The familiar roads. Today he barely noticed them. His mind kept returning to one question. Who had sent the screenshot? Not because he wanted to thank them. Because whoever sent it was close enough to the situation to know it existed. Close enough to access the conversation. Close enough to be worried. And perhaps close enough to help. That night, around 9 o'clock, his phone rang. Unknown number. Harold almost ignored it. Almost. Something told him not to. He answered. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a woman's voice appeared. Quiet. Careful. Nervous. Mr. Bennett? Yes. Another pause. I received your number from someone who thought I should call. Harold sat forward. The voice sounded familiar. Not familiar enough to identify. Just familiar enough to bother him. Who is this? The woman hesitated. Then finally answered. My name is Rebecca. Nothing. The name meant nothing to him. Yet she sounded frightened. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Frightened. And frightened people often know things. I don't have much time, she said. Then tell me what you called to say. Silence. A deep breath. Then 4 words. 4 words that changed everything. You're looking at this wrong. Harold felt every muscle in his body tighten. Because until that moment he believed he understood the situation. Maybe not perfectly, but enough. Now a complete stranger was telling him otherwise. What do you mean? The answer came immediately. The property isn't the objective. Harold's heart skipped. For weeks he had assumed the farm was the center of everything. The documents pointed there. The inquiries pointed there. The meetings pointed there. Yet Rebecca sounded certain. Certain in the way people sound when they've already seen the full picture. Then what is? The line went quiet. For several seconds he thought she might have hung up. Finally she spoke again. Her voice lower than before. Almost a whisper. The trust. Harold froze. Because in all the weeks of investigations, arguments, meetings, and warnings, almost nobody had mentioned the trust. And suddenly he realized something. The farm was visible. The trust wasn't. The farm attracted attention. The trust controlled everything behind the scenes. And if Rebecca was right, then Harold had been staring at the front door while someone else was quietly trying to enter through the back. Harold didn't sleep at all that night. Not because of fear. Not because of anger. Because of one word. Trust. For years, he had thought of the family trust as little more than a safeguard. Something he and Diane created long ago. Something responsible people did. The trust wasn't exciting. It wasn't something anyone talked about during family dinners. It wasn't something grandchildren asked about. Most of the time, Harold forgot it even existed. Until Rebecca mentioned it. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. The following morning, he arrived at Robert Callahan's office before it opened. The secretary looked surprised. Robert looked concerned. Harold handed over a sheet of paper. 3 words were written across the top. The trust. Nothing else. Robert stared at it. Then slowly removed his glasses. That reaction alone told Harold more than he wanted to know. You've been looking into the property. Robert spoke carefully. You've been looking into guardianship. He paused. You've been looking into asset management. Another pause. Then. But if someone gains influence over the trust. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Harold understood. The trust sat above everything. The property. The accounts. The investments. The future distribution. All of it. The farm was just one piece. The trust connected every piece. And suddenly Rebecca's warning made perfect sense. The farm was the distraction. The trust was the prize. For nearly an hour, Robert reviewed old documents. Then he opened a file Harold hadn't seen in years. The original trust agreement. Created shortly after Diane's cancer diagnosis. Updated twice afterward. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Until Robert reached the amendment section. Then he frowned. A small frown. But enough. What? Robert looked at him. When was the last time you reviewed this? Harold laughed. A short laugh. Probably 10 years ago. Robert nodded. Most people didn't. That wasn't unusual. Then he pointed to a section near the back. A succession provision. Technical language. Complicated language. The kind most people skip. Robert simplified it. If someone could successfully establish that you're unable to manage your affairs. Harold already knew where this was going. The acting authority changes immediately. Silence filled the room. Neither man spoke. Because both understood what that meant. The trust didn't need Harold to die. It only needed Harold to lose control. Suddenly every strange conversation became more dangerous. Every comment about memory. Every discussion about future planning. Every inquiry. Every meeting. Every document. The pieces were beginning to fit together. And Harold hated the picture they formed. Late that afternoon, another surprise arrived. This time it came from Emma, his granddaughter. She called while walking home from school. The conversation started normally. Homework. Friends. Basketball practice. Then she casually mentioned something. Something she didn't realize mattered. Grandpa? Yeah? Why was Uncle Brian at Mom's house? Harold frowned. Who? Uncle Brian. There was no Uncle Brian. At least not in the family. Emma quickly corrected herself. The lawyer guy. Harold sat up straight. What lawyer guy? The one that's been coming over. Silence. A very dangerous silence. Emma continued talking. Completely unaware. The one Mom and Dad keep meeting. Harold listened carefully now. Every word mattered. How many times? Lots. Recently? Since spring, I think. Spring. Months earlier. Long before the cruise discussion. Long before the assessment paperwork. Long before Harold became suspicious. Which meant one thing. Planning had begun much earlier than anyone realized. Much earlier than Susan realized. Possibly much earlier than Mark realized. Harold's instincts sharpened immediately. There was always a moment in every puzzle. A moment when random pieces stopped being random. This felt like that moment. After ending the call, Harold wrote down everything Emma remembered. Descriptions. Dates. Locations. Names. Even small details. Especially small details. Because small details often lead to large truths. That evening, Harold sat on the porch watching the sunset. The same sunset he had watched thousands of times. The pond reflected gold. The barn cast long shadows. The wind moved softly through the trees. Everything looked peaceful. Yet for the first time since Diane died, Harold felt completely alone. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Alone. Because he was beginning to understand something painful. The people around him weren't all seeing the same story. Susan thought she was watching a family disagreement. Mark probably thought he was helping. Karen likely believed she was protecting the future. The grandchildren knew almost nothing. And somewhere in the middle stood people Harold had never met. People who weren't family. People who weren't grieving. People who weren't emotionally involved. Yet somehow they kept appearing. At meetings. In conversations. In emails. Near decisions. That bothered him more than anything else. Families make mistakes. Families argue. Families hurt each other. But outsiders rarely become involved unless there's something worth gaining. As darkness settled over the property, Harold received one final message. A text. Unknown number. Only one sentence. No greeting. No signature. No explanation. Just one sentence. Check who scheduled the cognitive assessment. Harold stared at the screen. Cognitive assessment. The word sent a chill through him. Because nobody had ever mentioned a cognitive assessment. Not to him. Not once. Yet someone apparently expected one to happen. Or perhaps already knew one had. And if that was true, the people moving against Harold were much further ahead than he had imagined. Harold read the message 3 times. Then a 4th. The words never changed. Check who scheduled the cognitive assessment. He sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight. The phone remained in front of him. The message remained on the screen. Whoever sent it clearly knew something. The problem was that Harold didn't know whether the sender was trying to help him. Or manipulate him. Over the past several weeks, he had learned a painful lesson. Information wasn't always truth. Sometimes information was bait. Still, the message bothered him. Because it pointed towards something specific. Not a rumor. Not a theory. A cognitive assessment. The next morning, Harold called Robert. By noon they were sitting together again. Robert listened carefully. Then he asked a question Harold hadn't considered. Have you ever agreed to any medical evaluation recently? No. Any wellness review? No. Any senior care consultation? No. Robert nodded slowly. That answer seemed important to him. More important than Harold understood at first. Then Robert picked up the phone. 20 minutes later he had an answer. Not a complete answer. But enough. Enough to make Harold's stomach tighten. A request had been submitted. An inquiry. Not a completed assessment. Not yet. But someone had already explored the process. Someone had already contacted professionals. Someone had already started asking questions. Questions about Harold. Questions about competency evaluations. Questions about future care recommendations. Questions about legal capacity. The room fell silent. Harold stared out the office window. Cars moved through downtown traffic. People crossed the street. The world carried on as usual. Meanwhile, someone was apparently researching how to prove he could no longer manage his own affairs. What happens if they succeed? Harold finally asked. Robert answered immediately. They haven't. I know. But what if they did? The attorney hesitated. Not because he didn't know. Because he did. If enough people believe the narrative, it becomes harder to fight. Narrative. There was that word again. Not evidence. Not facts. Narrative. The story people choose to believe. Harold thought back over the previous year. The jokes about memory. The comments about aging. The concern. The subtle corrections. The reminders. The questions. Individually they seemed harmless. Together they formed something else. A story. A story about an aging man who might need help. A story Harold never agreed to tell. And yet somehow it was already being told. That afternoon he drove home by a different route. Not intentionally. His mind was elsewhere. Halfway home he stopped at a small gas station. The sort of place where everyone knew everyone. The cashier greeted him by name. So did two customers. One asked about fishing. Another asked about football. Normal conversations. Normal people. Normal life. As Harold walked back toward his truck, he suddenly realized something. Nobody here treated him like a confused old man. Nobody here questioned his judgment. Nobody here worried whether he could make decisions. Because outside a small circle of people, that story didn't exist. The realization hit him hard. Narratives require audiences. And somebody had been carefully building one. That evening another piece fell into place. Completely by accident. Again. Harold was reviewing old family photographs when he found an envelope tucked between two albums. Inside were notes written by Diane. Simple notes. Household reminders. Holiday plans. Garden schedules. Then one page caught his attention. Not because of what it said. Because of the date. 2 years before Diane passed away. The note listed names. Family members. Beneficiaries. Trust discussions. Future plans. At the bottom Diane had written something in her neat handwriting. A sentence Harold hadn't seen before. Be careful who advises the children after we're gone. Harold froze. The room suddenly felt very quiet. He read it again. Then again. The words felt strangely alive. As though Diane were speaking directly to him. Be careful who advises the children after we're gone. Not. Be careful of the children. Be careful who advises them. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because for weeks Harold had been focused on Mark. Focused on Karen. Focused on Susan. Maybe he had been looking in the wrong direction. Maybe the real influence wasn't sitting at the family table. Maybe it was sitting behind it. The following day brought the biggest surprise yet. Susan called. This time she sounded different. Not nervous. Determined. Dad. What is it? I found something. Harold sat upright. Immediately alert. What did you find? Susan lowered her voice. As if someone might overhear. A document. What kind of document? Another pause. Then. A presentation. The word sounded ridiculous. A presentation. Not a legal filing. Not a court document. A presentation. Yet the fear in Susan's voice was real. What presentation? Susan inhaled slowly. The one they showed during the Indianapolis meeting. Harold's pulse quickened. Because until now he had imagined discussions. Conversations. Arguments. Ideas. A presentation meant something different. A presentation meant preparation. Planning. Structure. Slides. Talking points. A message designed to persuade people. Dad. Susan's voice trembled slightly. It wasn't about helping you. The silence that followed seemed endless. Then she spoke the sentence Harold would remember for the rest of his life. It was about managing you. And in that moment, Harold realized the battle ahead was larger than he had imagined. Because somebody hadn't simply prepared paperwork. They had prepared a strategy. Harold didn't say anything for several seconds. He simply listened. The old refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the fields. Do you have it? He finally asked. Susan hesitated. Part of it. Part of it was enough. At least for now. The document arrived 20 minutes later. Not through email. Not through a shared folder. Susan drove to his house herself. That alone told Harold how serious this had become. By the time she arrived, the rain had intensified. Harold watched her run from the car carrying a manila envelope beneath her jacket. The moment she stepped inside, she locked the door. Not something she normally did. Neither of them mentioned it. She handed him the envelope. Harold opened it slowly. Inside were printed slides. Not many. Only 11 pages. But 11 pages were enough. The title page carried a heading. Future Family Asset Continuity Strategy. Harold read the words twice. The language sounded professional. Polished. Corporate. Not family language. Nobody planning a family barbecue creates a presentation called Future Family Asset Continuity Strategy. The second slide was worse. It contained a chart. Boxes. Arrows. Names. Decision pathways. Authority transfers. Contingency plans. Harold felt his stomach tighten. Because his own name appeared in the center. Not as a person. As a process. A problem to be managed. A variable to be controlled. A step in a sequence. For the first time, he understood why Susan sounded frightened. This wasn't a discussion. It was a roadmap. The third slide contained bullet points. Most were harmless. Property maintenance. Financial oversight. Future tax efficiency. Then one line caught his attention. Preparation for reduced decision capacity scenario. Harold stared at it. Reduced decision capacity. There it was again. The same idea. The same narrative. Different words. Same destination. His eyes moved lower. Another bullet point. Family communication alignment. Another. Transition leadership structure. Another. Risk management regarding resistance. Harold stopped reading. Resistance. The word lingered in his mind. Not disagreement. Not discussion. Resistance. The kind of word people use when they expect opposition. The kind of word people use when they have already chosen a direction and no longer care whether everyone agrees. Susan sat silently across from him. Waiting. Finally Harold looked up. Who made this? Susan shook her head. I don't know. He believed her. At least partially. Because whoever created the presentation wasn't thinking like family. They were thinking like a consultant. Or an advisor. Or someone who saw people as pieces on a board. Harold continued reading. Slide after slide. Each one added another piece to the picture. None of them mentioned stealing. None of them mentioned fraud. None of them contained anything obviously illegal. That was what made them dangerous. Everything sounded reasonable. Responsible. Practical. If a stranger read them, they might even agree. Until they realized the subject wasn't a corporation. It wasn't a business. It was a living person. One who had never been invited into the conversation. Then Harold reached the final page. And everything changed. The last slide wasn't complete. The bottom half had been cut off before Susan obtained it. Most of the information was missing. But one section remained visible. Attendees. A list of names. Mark. Karen. Several unfamiliar names. Then one name Harold recognized immediately. A name he hadn't thought about in years. Gregory Dalton. Harold froze. Susan noticed immediately. You know him? Harold leaned back slowly. Very slowly. The rain continued outside. The room felt strangely distant. As if everything had suddenly moved further away. Yeah. His voice sounded different now. Lower. Harder. Unfortunately, I do. Gregory Dalton wasn't family. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a financial planner. He wasn't even a friend. Years earlier, Gregory had worked as a consultant during a complicated acquisition involving Harold's business. The man was intelligent. Charismatic. Persuasive. And completely obsessed with control. He viewed relationships as leverage. Conversations as negotiations. People as assets. Harold hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. At least, not directly. Yet somehow Gregory's name had appeared inside a presentation discussing Harold's future. The realization hit him like a punch. For weeks Harold had been trying to answer the wrong question. The question was never, who benefits? The answer to that was obvious. The real question was, who designed the plan? And for the first time since this all began, Harold believed he finally had a name. He looked at Susan. Then at the papers. Then back at Susan. Did Mark know he was involved? She hesitated. And that hesitation told him everything. Because if she couldn't answer immediately, the truth was complicated. Very complicated. Which meant the next conversation Harold needed to have wasn't with a lawyer. And it wasn't with Karen. It was with his son. Because sooner or later, Harold needed to discover whether Mark was helping build the plan. Or whether he had become another piece inside it. Mark called the following evening. For the first time in weeks, Harold didn't answer. Not immediately. He let the phone ring. Then ring again. Then stop. A minute later, it rang a second time. Mark never called twice. Not unless something was wrong. Harold answered on the third attempt. Hello. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Dad. His son's voice sounded strained. Tired. As if he hadn't slept much either. Everything okay? Harold asked. A simple question. The sort fathers ask automatically. The irony wasn't lost on him. For weeks people had been discussing his future without him. Yet his first instinct was still to check on his son. Mark exhaled slowly. We need to talk. There it was. The phrase every family dreads. Not because of the words. Because of what usually follows them. Harold looked through the kitchen window. The sun was setting behind the barn. Orange light stretched across the fields. A beautiful evening. The sort of evening Diane used to call wasted if nobody sat outside to enjoy it. When? Tomorrow. Here. Another pause. Then. No. Interesting. Where? A restaurant in Indianapolis. That answer told Harold plenty. People choose neutral locations when they don't want conversations happening at home. Or when they expect conflict. Or witnesses. Harold agreed. Then ended the call. The next morning he arrived 15 minutes early. Old habits. The restaurant sat inside a business district. Modern. Quiet. The kind of place people choose when they want privacy without attracting attention. Mark was already there. Alone. At least at first. Harold noticed something immediately. His son looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence Harold usually saw wasn't there. Neither was the certainty. For several minutes they talked about nothing. Coffee. Traffic. The weather. Two men circling the real conversation. Finally Mark spoke. Dad, I know you've been asking questions. Harold nodded. I've been getting answers too. Mark looked away. That wasn't the response he expected. The waiter arrived. Left. The silence returned. Then Mark leaned forward. You think I'm trying to take everything? Harold considered the statement. No. Mark blinked. No. No. The answer genuinely surprised him. Harold continued. I think somebody convinced you that you're helping. For the first time all morning, Mark didn't know what to say. Because the sentence landed too close to the truth. Harold could see it. Sometimes a person's face reveals what words never will. The conversation slowed. Then shifted. And little by little, pieces began emerging. Months earlier, Gregory Dalton entered the picture through a business contact. At first he wasn't discussing Harold. He was discussing family succession planning. Generational wealth. Asset protection. The future. All the things responsible families supposedly should discuss. Mark listened. Karen listened. Others listened. The advice sounded reasonable. Professional. Smart. The sort of advice successful people pay for. Then the conversations became more specific. Gradually. Almost invisibly. What if Harold became sick? What if something happened unexpectedly? What if decisions needed to be made quickly? What if the family wasn't prepared? Every question sounded practical. Every suggestion sounded responsible. Until eventually everyone stopped discussing possibilities. And started discussing Harold himself. Mark rubbed his forehead. Looking exhausted. I didn't see it happening. Harold believed him. That was the strange part. For weeks Harold imagined a villain. A mastermind. A son plotting behind closed doors. Reality looked messier. Much messier. Reality usually does. Did you know about the assessment requests? Mark shook his head immediately. Too quickly to be rehearsed. Did you know about the inquiries? Another shake. What about the meetings? Mark hesitated. A dangerous hesitation. Because now the answer wasn't simple. I knew about some of them. Some. Not all. Interesting. Then Harold asked the question he had wanted answered for weeks. Did you ever tell anyone I wasn't capable of managing my affairs? Mark looked genuinely shocked. No. Not defensive. Not angry. Shocked. The reaction felt real. Harold watched carefully. Years of business had taught him to recognize performance. This didn't look like performance. This looked like a man discovering how far something had gone. Then Mark said something unexpected. Something Harold hadn't anticipated. Karen doesn't know everything either. That sentence changed the room. Because until now Harold imagined two sides. Maybe three. Now he was seeing layers. People being influenced by people who were themselves being influenced. Advice becoming plans. Plans becoming assumptions. Assumptions becoming actions. Without anyone fully understanding where the road ended. Then Mark lowered his voice. Gregory has another meeting tomorrow. Harold froze. Not visibly. Inside. What meeting? Mark looked around the restaurant. Then back at his father. The real meeting. The phrase hung in the air. The real meeting. Meaning everything before this had only been preparation. Harold suddenly understood why Susan had been frightened. Why Rebecca had called. Why somebody anonymously leaked screenshots. Because not everyone inside the plan agreed with the plan. Some people were starting to see it too late. And some were trying to stop it before it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What happens at this meeting? Mark swallowed. Then answered. I think they're planning the final recommendation. Harold sat perfectly still. The final recommendation. A harmless phrase. Another one of those professional expressions that hid uncomfortable truths. But Harold knew better now. Every major step in this story had arrived disguised as something reasonable. And if Gregory Dalton was gathering everyone for a final recommendation, then the game was entering its final stage. For the first time since Diane died, Harold looked at his son and saw something unexpected. Not an opponent. Not an ally. A man standing in the middle of a storm he helped create. And tomorrow, both of them were going to discover exactly who Gregory Dalton had been working for all along. The next 24 hours felt longer than the previous month. Harold returned home after meeting Mark, but he didn't feel relieved. If anything, he felt worse. Because uncertainty is painful. But partial truth can be even worse. At least uncertainty leaves possibilities open. Now Harold knew enough to understand the danger. Just not enough to understand the destination. The following morning began quietly. Too quietly. The sky hung low over the farm. Gray clouds drifted across the fields. The sort of morning that made everything feel suspended. Waiting. Harold spent most of it reviewing notes. Names. Dates. Meetings. Phone calls. Documents. The kitchen table had become a command center. Pages covered nearly every surface. A stranger walking into the room might have mistaken it for a business investigation. In many ways, it was. Shortly after noon, Robert called. His voice sounded unusually direct. Something happened. Harold sat upright. What? The meeting location changed. That immediately caught his attention. People only change plans at the last minute for two reasons. Fear. Or new information. How do you know? I received a call. From who? Robert paused. Someone who doesn't want their name involved. Another anonymous source. Another crack in the wall. Another person who had apparently decided Gregory Dalton shouldn't be trusted. The list was growing. Rebecca. The email sender. Whoever called Robert. Maybe others. For the first time, Harold began wondering how many people inside the operation were secretly uncomfortable. How many had started believing one thing and discovered something else entirely? The meeting was now scheduled for a private conference room above a financial consulting office. Not a law office. Not a medical office. A consulting office. That detail bothered Harold. Because consultants sell recommendations. Recommendations become plans. Plans become actions. And actions change lives. By late afternoon, Harold, Robert, and Susan were sitting together in Robert's office. Nobody seemed relaxed. Not even Robert. Susan looked exhausted. Harold felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that sometimes arrives just before an important moment. Then Robert's phone vibrated. A message. He read it. Then slowly looked up. Something in his expression changed. "What is it?" Harold asked. Robert handed him the phone. A photograph filled the screen. It appeared to have been taken through a partially open doorway. The image wasn't perfect. But it was clear enough. A conference room. Several people seated around a table. Gregory Dalton standing near a screen. And projected on that screen was Harold's photograph. A recent photograph. Large enough for everyone in the room to see. Nobody spoke. Not for several seconds. Then Susan whispered, "Oh my God." Harold continued staring. The image disturbed him far more than the paperwork ever had. Because paperwork feels distant. A photograph feels personal. Somewhere in that room, strangers were discussing his future. Studying his life. Evaluating options. Making recommendations. And he wasn't even there. Then Robert zoomed in. The screen behind Gregory contained text. Most of it was too blurry to read. Except for one line. One line that remained visible. Recommended transition timeline. Timeline. Not possibility. Not discussion. Timeline. A schedule. A plan already moving forward. Harold slowly handed the phone back. The room fell silent again. Then Susan spoke. Her voice trembling. "I thought they were preparing." Nobody answered. Because everyone in the room had reached the same conclusion. Preparation was over. Execution had begun. The realization changed everything. For weeks Harold had been reacting. Investigating. Following clues. Trying to understand. Now the situation was different. Now he knew there was a deadline. A timeline. A next step. Which meant one thing. Gregory Dalton intended to move soon. Very soon. As evening approached, another message arrived. This time from Mark. Only 4 words. "Call me immediately." Harold dialed before the message notification disappeared. Mark answered instantly. His breathing sounded uneven. Like someone who had been moving quickly. Or arguing. Or both. "Dad." "What happened?" A long pause. Then came the sentence. The sentence that changed the entire direction of the story. "They never wanted me in charge." Harold froze. "What?" "They used me." The words came quickly now. Raw. Unfiltered. "They told me I was helping protect the family." Harold listened. Not interrupting. Not judging. Mark sounded like a man finally seeing something clearly for the first time. "They never planned to give control to me." Another pause. Then. "Dad. I think Gregory has been working for someone else." The room suddenly felt smaller. Because until now Gregory Dalton had appeared to be the architect. The strategist. The man pulling the strings. But if Mark was right, then Gregory might only be another layer. Another piece. Another mask. And somewhere above him, someone else had been quietly directing the entire operation from the shadows. For the first time since this began, Harold realized the story wasn't reaching its conclusion. It was reaching a much larger truth. And that truth was waiting at the top of the staircase. Just beyond the next door. Harold ended the call and stared at the dark kitchen window. For weeks he had imagined a simple story. A son. A daughter-in-law. A bad decision. Maybe a little greed. Maybe a little fear. Real life rarely stays that simple. Now the picture looked very different. Mark wasn't standing at the center. He was standing inside it. And apparently he wasn't the only one. The next morning began before sunrise. Harold couldn't sleep. The coffee tasted stronger than usual. Or maybe everything felt stronger now. Outside, fog drifted across the pond. The barn emerged slowly from the gray morning haze. Diane used to love mornings like that. She said fog forced people to slow down. Forced them to pay attention. Harold wished she were there. Not because she would solve the problem. Because she always knew where to look. By 8 o'clock, Mark arrived. Alone. No Karen. No children. No excuses. The moment Harold opened the door, he knew something had changed. Mark looked shaken. Not guilty. Shaken. Like a man who had just discovered the floor beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Harold had taught him multiplication. The same table where Diane wrapped Christmas gifts. The same table where countless family birthdays had been celebrated. Funny how ordinary furniture ends up witnessing extraordinary moments. For a while neither spoke. Then Mark reached into his jacket. And pulled out a folder. Harold almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it felt familiar. Every major turn in this story seemed to involve a folder. This one was thinner. Only a few pages. Mark slid it across the table. I wasn't supposed to have this. Harold opened it. The first page contained meeting notes. The second contained projected timelines. The third stopped him cold. At the top was a heading. Successor Oversight Structure. Underneath were several names. Gregory Dalton. 2 consultants Harold didn't recognize. 1 financial planning firm. 1 elder care advisory company. Then another section. Potential family representatives. Mark's name appeared there. Karen's name appeared there. Susan's did not. Harold wasn't surprised. What surprised him was the notation beside Mark's name. Not recommended. Harold read it twice. Then looked up. Mark nodded. I saw that too. For several seconds nobody spoke. Because suddenly a great deal made sense. The promises. The meetings. The encouragement. The pressure. Gregory had never been building a future for Mark. He had been using Mark to gain access. Access to family discussions. Access to trust information. Access to decision makers. Mark leaned back in his chair. Looking older than his 46 years. I feel stupid. Harold shook his head. No. I should have seen it. Maybe. The honesty surprised both of them. Harold wasn't interested in comforting him. Not completely. Some mistakes deserved discomfort. Growth often starts there. But Harold also knew manipulation rarely begins with obvious lies. It begins with reasonable truths. Then slowly changes direction. Mark stared at the documents. They kept talking about protecting the family. Harold nodded. They always do. The sentence lingered between them. Because over the years Harold had learned something. People rarely announce selfish intentions. They wrap them in noble language. Protection. Security. Responsibility. Planning. The words sound good. Until you examine where they lead. Then Mark said something unexpected. Something that changed everything. There's another meeting tonight. Harold looked up immediately. Another meeting. Not next week. Not next month. Tonight. Events were accelerating. The timeline Gregory presented was moving fast. Who'll be there? Mark listed several names. Some familiar. Most unfamiliar. Then he mentioned one name Harold had never heard before. Victoria Mercer. The name meant nothing. At least initially. But Mark's expression changed when he said it. Harold noticed. Who is she? Mark hesitated. She's the investor. Investor. The word felt completely out of place. Investor in what? This wasn't a company acquisition. This wasn't commercial property. This was a family. Harold felt something shift inside him. A realization. Small at first. Then larger. Then impossible to ignore. Gregory Dalton wasn't behaving like a family advisor. He wasn't behaving like an estate planner. He wasn't behaving like someone trying to protect Harold. He was behaving like someone building a transaction. And transactions always have buyers. For the first time, Harold began wondering whether the farm, the trust, the accounts, everything, had been evaluated as an opportunity. Not by family. By outsiders. Outsiders who saw numbers where Harold saw memories. Assets where Harold saw a lifetime. Mark watched the realization spread across his father's face. Then quietly confirmed it. Dad. Harold looked at him. I think they were planning something much bigger than we thought. Outside, the fog had finally lifted. The field stretched clear to the horizon. For weeks Harold had been walking through uncertainty. Now the outlines were beginning to appear. Not clearly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to understand that Gregory Dalton might never have been the destination. Only the bridge. And somewhere beyond him stood the people who expected to profit when the entire plan was finished. The people who believed Harold Bennett was too old to notice. Too isolated to fight back. Too late to stop them. They were wrong. That evening, Harold didn't attend the meeting. Neither did Mark. For the first time since this entire mess began, they made a deliberate choice. Not to react. To observe. Gregory Dalton had spent months believing he controlled the flow of information. There was no reason to warn him that the flow had changed. Around 7 o'clock, Mark received a message. A reminder about the meeting. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. At least on the surface. But Harold noticed something. Nobody asked whether Mark would attend. Nobody confirmed. Nobody followed up. The message assumed compliance. The way people message employees. Not partners. That bothered Mark more than he admitted. The two men sat quietly on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. For years Harold had imagined this stage of life differently. He imagined fishing trips. Family barbecues. Watching grandchildren grow. Not sitting beside his son while trying to untangle a web of manipulation. Yet strangely, it was the closest they had felt in months. Maybe years. Around 9:30, Susan called. Her voice sounded breathless. Dad. What happened? The meeting ended early. That wasn't expected. Everything about Gregory suggested a man who liked control. People like that rarely end meetings early. Why? Another pause. Then Susan answered. Because they argued. Harold exchanged a glance with Mark. More cracks. More fractures. The pressure was growing. What were they arguing about? I don't know everything. That part was probably true. But I know one thing. Harold waited. They didn't agree on the timeline. Timeline. There was that word again. The timeline. The schedule. The deadline. Whatever they were planning, time mattered. A lot. After the call ended, Harold couldn't stop thinking about it. Why the urgency? Why now? Why after years of leaving him alone? The question followed him into the night. And sometime after midnight, the answer arrived. Not completely. Just enough. Harold woke up suddenly. No reason. No sound. No nightmare. Just awake. At first he didn't know why. Then he remembered something. A conversation from nearly 18 months earlier. A conversation so ordinary he had forgotten it. Until now. Diane's younger brother, Frank, had visited the farm. The two men spent an afternoon reviewing old records. Family history. Property boundaries. Trust documents. The sort of thing older men discuss when they think nobody is listening. Frank had asked a question. A strange question. At least it seemed strange at the time. What happens when the final restriction expires? Harold sat upright in bed. The memory hit him all at once. The final restriction. The trust. The amendment. The date. For several seconds he simply stared into the darkness. Then he got up. Crossed the house. Opened the old filing cabinet. Pulled out the original trust documents. 20 minutes later he found it. A clause. Buried deep inside the paperwork. Easy to miss. Easy to forget. A restriction period. Created years ago. Agreed upon by Harold and Diane. The restriction expired in less than 4 months. Harold felt his pulse quicken. Because suddenly the timeline made sense. The meetings. The urgency. The pressure. The recommendations. The discussions. All of it. For years, certain actions involving the trust required specific protections. Specific approvals. Specific limitations. But once that restriction expired, everything became easier. Much easier. Harold immediately called Robert the next morning. The attorney reviewed the documents. Then slowly nodded. You found it. Harold already knew he had. What does it mean? Robert removed his glasses. It means somebody has been counting down. The room became silent. Because that sentence explained everything. Not the details. Not every player. But the urgency. People weren't rushing because Harold was aging. They were rushing because a window was opening. A window worth waiting for. A window somebody had apparently spent months preparing to use. Then Robert said something that surprised him. Harold, if this is what I think it is. He stopped. Choosing his words carefully. Then Gregory Dalton may not be the one making the decisions. The same conclusion was appearing everywhere. Mark believed it. Susan suspected it. Rebecca hinted at it. Now Robert was saying it too. Gregory was important. But important people are not always powerful people. Sometimes they're only the face. The presenter. The salesman. The person standing at the front of the room. While someone else sits quietly in the back. Watching. Waiting. Benefiting. As Harold drove home that afternoon, he passed the pond. The barn. The fields. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet he saw it differently now. Not because the land had changed. Because he understood why people wanted influence over it. Not for the memories. Not for the history. Not for Diane. Not for family. For leverage. For opportunity. For money. The realization should have made him angry. Instead it made him calm. Very calm. Because for the first time since receiving that phone call about the family trip, Harold finally knew something important. The people moving against him were no longer ahead. They thought they were. They still believed he was reacting. Still believed he was confused. Still believed he was isolated. In reality, the distance between them was shrinking. And somewhere inside that shrinking gap, someone was starting to panic. Because secrets become dangerous the moment they stop staying secret. 2 days later, Harold received the call he had been expecting. Just not from the person he expected. It came from Karen. For nearly a month, every meaningful conversation had happened through someone else. Mark. Susan. Lawyers. Anonymous sources. Karen had remained strangely quiet. That changed at 8:17 on a Wednesday morning. Her name appeared on his phone. Harold answered. "Good morning, Karen." The silence lasted only a second. But it was enough. Enough to tell him she had rehearsed this conversation. People who call naturally start talking. People who prepare speeches pause first. Harold. Not Dad. Not Harold's usual title in the family. Just Harold. Formal. Careful. Controlled. He noticed immediately. "What can I do for you?" Another pause. Then she began. She talked about family. Concern. Communication. Misunderstandings. Healing. The same collection of safe words people often use when they're trying to discuss something dangerous. Harold listened patiently. 10 minutes passed. Karen said a great deal. Almost none of it mattered. Because she still hadn't reached the reason for the call. Eventually she did. Some people feel things have become unnecessarily complicated. There it was. The pitch. The real conversation. Harold remained silent. Karen continued. "There may be a way to simplify everything." Simplify. Another interesting word. Over the last month Harold had noticed something. Whenever someone wanted control, they called it simplification. Whenever someone wanted authority, they called it protection. Whenever someone wanted access, they called it planning. The words changed. The destination didn't. "What exactly are you proposing?" For the first time, Karen sounded relieved. Like a salesperson finally reaching the presentation. A family agreement. Harold almost smiled. Family agreement. The latest label. What kind of agreement? Karen explained. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Carefully. A temporary oversight committee. A coordinated management structure. Shared decision-making. Future planning. The language sounded familiar. Very familiar. Because Harold had already seen versions of it inside the presentation Susan discovered. The difference was that Karen didn't know he had seen it. Which meant she was unknowingly confirming everything. When the call ended, Harold sat quietly for a long time. Then he called Robert. The attorney listened. Took notes. Asked questions. Finally he said something interesting. "She's not negotiating." "What is she doing?" "Testing." The answer made sense immediately. Nobody sends a proposal before measuring resistance. Karen wasn't asking. She was assessing. Trying to determine how much Harold knew. How much Harold suspected. How much Harold would fight. That realization brought an unexpected sense of confidence. Because if they were still testing him, they still didn't understand his position. And ignorance cuts both ways. That afternoon brought another surprise. Mark arrived unexpectedly. Again. This time carrying a laptop. Without speaking, he placed it on the kitchen table. Then opened a file. A spreadsheet. Rows. Columns. Dates. Names. Payments. Harold leaned forward. At first it looked ordinary. Consulting invoices. Advisory fees. Administrative expenses. Then he noticed something strange. The amounts kept increasing. Every few months. Larger. 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 What's this? Mark looked uncomfortable. Gone through company records. Whose company? The consulting group Gregory works with. Harold stared at the numbers. One line item immediately stood out. Strategic Family Transition Project. Harold read it twice. Then a third time. The project had started nearly a year earlier. Nearly a year. Months before the first concern. Months before the first conversation. Months before the first meeting. Months before anyone supposedly became worried about Harold. The realization hit both men simultaneously. Concern had not created the project. The project had created the concern. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Mark quietly said, "I think they already had a plan before they ever approached us." Harold nodded. Because that was exactly what the timeline suggested. First came the project. Then came the advisors. Then came the meetings. Then came the narrative. Then came the recommendations. Everything flowed in one direction. Everything followed a sequence. And sequences don't happen by accident. They happen by design. As evening approached, Harold sat alone on the porch. The spreadsheet rested beside him. The wind moved through the fields. A tractor hummed somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. For the first time since this story began, Harold stopped asking, "Why is this happening?" He now understood that. Money. Control. Opportunity. No. The more important question had become, who paid for it? Because projects cost money. Consultants cost money. Meetings cost money. Research costs money. Someone had invested heavily in this effort. And investors expect returns. The thought lingered long after sunset. Then, just before midnight, his phone buzzed. A new message. Another unknown number. Only one sentence. No greeting. No signature. No explanation. Just a sentence. Victoria Mercer is not the client. Harold stared at the screen. Slowly. Carefully. Because if Victoria Mercer wasn't the client, then the person truly behind everything still hadn't appeared. And that meant the biggest reveal of the entire story was still waiting somewhere ahead. Harold didn't tell anyone about the message. Not Robert. Not Susan. Not even Mark. At least not immediately. Over the past several weeks, he had learned another lesson. Information changes behavior. The moment people know what you know, they start adjusting. And Harold wasn't ready for that. The message remained on his phone. Victoria Mercer is not the client. Simple. Direct. Terrifying. Because it meant everything he thought he understood was still incomplete. The next morning, Harold drove to Indianapolis. Not because he had a meeting. Because he wanted to see something for himself. The consulting office Gregory used sat inside a modern glass building downtown. Professional. Expensive. The kind of place designed to impress people. Harold parked across the street. Bought a coffee. And watched. Hours passed. People came and went. Most meant nothing. Until shortly after noon. A black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Nothing unusual about that. Except for the man who stepped out. Harold knew him immediately. Not because they were friends. Because he had spent years competing against him. Richard Holloway. The name hit him like a forgotten memory. Older now. Grayer. But unmistakable. For years, Richard had been one of the largest land developers in the region. A smart man. A wealthy man. A patient man. And a man who never spent money unless he expected to make more. Harold watched him enter the building, then disappear upstairs. For several seconds he simply sat there, trying to understand why the sight disturbed him so much. Then the answer arrived. Not all at once. Gradually. Like sunlight breaking through clouds. 20 years ago, Richard Holloway tried to purchase part of Harold's property. Not all of it. Just a section. The section bordering a future development corridor. At the time Harold refused. Not because of the money. Because Diane loved that land. The conversation ended. The years passed. Everyone moved on. Or so Harold believed. By the time he arrived home, he was thinking differently. Very differently. That evening he called Robert. Do me a favor. What kind of favor? I need to know everything you can find about Richard Holloway. Silence. Then. Why? Because I think we're finally asking the right question. Robert didn't argue. The following afternoon, the answer began arriving. Not complete answers. Pieces. Always pieces. Richard Holloway had quietly expanded his holdings over the past decade. Large parcels. Agricultural corridors. Development zones. Infrastructure projects. Nothing illegal. Nothing suspicious. Just business. Very successful business. Then Robert discovered something else. Something much more interesting. A proposal. Several years old. Never approved. Never publicly announced. A regional development project. Large enough to attract investors. Large enough to attract consultants. Large enough to generate enormous profits. One section of the proposal included a map. Harold stared at it. The moment he saw it, he understood. Because directly in the center of the proposed expansion area sat his farm. Not beside it. Not near it. Directly in the center. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Robert quietly said, "Now we know why the property matters." Harold shook his head. "No." Robert looked confused. Harold pointed to the map. "The property explains the beginning." Then he pointed to the trust documents. "The trust explains the method." Then he tapped the consultant reports. "But it still doesn't explain the people." That remained the missing piece. The largest piece. Because if Richard Holloway wanted land, there were easier ways to pursue it. Cleaner ways. Faster ways. Something else connected all of this together. Something still hidden. 2 nights later, Mark called. His voice sounded urgent. "Dad. What happened?" "I found Gregory's contract." Harold sat upright. "What contract?" "The original one." The room suddenly felt smaller. Because contracts don't contain opinions. Contracts contain intentions. "What does it say?" Mark hesitated. Then answered. "It's not with Karen." "Not surprising." "It's not with me." "Expected." "It's not with Victoria Mercer either." Harold already suspected that. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that finally exposed the first truly hidden player. "Dad." Mark swallowed. The contract was signed by someone in the family. For several seconds, Harold forgot how to breathe. Because until now the story had divided itself neatly. Family. Outsiders. Manipulators. Victims. Now those lines were disappearing. Someone inside the family had been involved from the beginning. Not influenced. Not recruited. Involved. The distinction mattered. A lot. Who? Mark didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation frightened Harold more than anything he had heard so far. Because there are only a few reasons people hesitate. One reason is uncertainty. Another is fear. But the most dangerous reason is heartbreak. When Mark finally spoke, his voice sounded almost broken. Dad. Another pause. Then. I think it's Uncle Frank. Harold closed his eyes. Slowly. Because suddenly Diane's old note returned to him. Be careful who advises the children after we're gone. Not. Be careful of the children. Be careful who advises them. And for the first time since this story began, Harold wondered whether Diane had seen something years ago that nobody else had noticed. Something that was only now coming to the surface. And if Frank truly stood behind Gregory, then the next conversation Harold needed to have would be the hardest one of all. Because this wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't just about property. It wasn't even just about family. It was about betrayal. The kind that takes years to reveal itself. Harold didn't call Frank immediately. Some conversations deserve preparation. Others deserve certainty. This one deserved both. For nearly a week, he carried the information quietly. Not because he didn't believe Mark. Because he wanted proof. Real proof. Frank wasn't just Diane's younger brother. He had been part of Harold's life for over 50 years. He attended birthdays, holidays, graduations, funerals. He helped build the barn. He taught Mark how to fish. He stood beside Harold at Diane's funeral. You don't accuse someone like that based on suspicion. Not unless you're prepared to live with the consequences. 3 days later, Robert called. And for the first time in weeks, he sounded genuinely surprised. I found something. Harold sat forward. What? A payment trail. That immediately got his attention. Because paper trails tell stories. Unlike people. Paper doesn't care about emotions. It doesn't protect reputations. It simply records what happened. Robert continued. A consulting contract had indeed been executed. Gregory Dalton's firm received payments. Those payments flowed through multiple entities. Multiple accounts. Multiple intermediaries. Complicated enough to discourage casual inspection. But not complicated enough to disappear entirely. Eventually the trail reached its source. A family holding company. Harold recognized the name immediately. The company belonged to Frank. For several seconds, Harold simply stared at the wall. Not shocked. Not anymore. Part of him had already known. The rest had simply been catching up. What was the stated purpose? Robert flipped through notes. Family succession planning. Harold laughed. A short, bitter laugh. Every ugly thing in this story seemed to arrive wrapped inside beautiful language. Protection. Planning. Support. Succession. The words changed. The objective didn't. That evening, Harold drove to Frank's house. Not because he wanted to. Because avoiding the conversation wouldn't change the truth. The house sat beside a small lake about 40 minutes away. Frank answered the door himself. The moment their eyes met, Harold knew. Not because Frank confessed. Not because he looked guilty. Because he looked tired. The kind of tired people become when they've been carrying a secret for too long. Neither man spoke. Finally Frank stepped aside. Come in. The living room looked exactly the same. Fishing photographs. Family pictures. Old furniture. Half a century of memories. The setting felt familiar. The conversation didn't. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. The weather. The lake. Football. Two old men delaying the inevitable. Eventually Harold placed a folder on the coffee table. Gregory's contract. Payment records. Consulting invoices. Frank stared at the documents. Then slowly leaned back. No denial. No outrage. No surprise. Just silence. And silence can be an answer. Finally Harold asked the question. Why? Frank closed his eyes. Not dramatically. Just briefly. As if searching for the least painful version of the truth. When he spoke, his voice sounded older than Harold remembered. It wasn't supposed to become this. Harold waited. Because explanations often begin with excuses. The truth usually arrives later. Frank continued. Years ago, development groups began approaching him. Investors. Consultants. Land specialists. People discussing future growth. Future opportunities. Future value. At first, he ignored them. Then the offers increased. The projections increased. The numbers increased. Eventually one idea took hold. The land around Harold's farm would become enormously valuable. Not immediately. But soon. Very soon. And that's where everything started. Not with greed. With rationalization. The most dangerous thing in the world. People rarely wake up intending to betray family. They convince themselves they're helping. Then move the line a little. Then a little more. Then a little more. Until one day they discover they've crossed it entirely. Frank looked down at the floor. I thought I was protecting the future. Harold shook his head. No. The answer came immediately. Firmly. Without anger. Without hesitation. You were trying to control it. The room became quiet. Because both men knew it was true. Frank didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. Didn't justify it. That told Harold something. Deep down, Frank already understood. The hardest truths are often the ones we already know. Then Frank revealed something neither Harold nor Robert had expected. Gregory Dalton wasn't hired to take the farm. He wasn't hired to take the trust. He wasn't hired to remove Harold. He was hired to secure one thing. Influence. Influence over future decisions. Influence over timing. Influence over family representatives. Because once influence exists, ownership often follows later. Harold finally understood. This was never a theft. It was a takeover. Slow. Polite. Professional. Wrapped in concern. Presented as responsibility. But a takeover all the same. Then Frank said the words that changed everything. The words Harold would remember for the rest of his life. I tried to stop it. Harold looked up. For the first time all evening. Really looked at him. What? Frank nodded slowly. His eyes filled with regret. Real regret. Not the regret of being caught. The regret of realizing something too late. I brought Gregory in. Another pause. Then. And eventually Gregory stopped working for me. The room fell silent. Because suddenly the entire story shifted again. Frank had started the process. But somewhere along the way, he lost control of it. And if that was true, then the most dangerous person in the story still hadn't been revealed. Not Gregory. Not Frank. Not Karen. Not Mark. Someone else. Someone who stepped in after the machine was already running. Someone who saw an opportunity. Someone who understood that families are easier to manipulate when they're already divided. And somewhere out there, that person still believed Harold Bennett hadn't figured it out yet. Harold drove home from Frank's house in complete silence. The road stretched through miles of farmland. Fields. Barns. Old fences. The same landscape he had known for decades. Yet everything looked different now. Not because the land had changed. Because the story had changed. For weeks Harold believed he was uncovering a conspiracy. Now he understood something more complicated. The conspiracy had evolved. Frank started it. Gregory expanded it. And somewhere along the way, someone else had taken control. That realization bothered him more than anything else. Because it meant the person currently steering events had remained invisible. Invisible people are dangerous. Especially when they prefer it that way. The following morning, Harold called Robert. Then Susan. Then Mark. By noon they were sitting together in Robert's office. For the first time, nobody was hiding information. Nobody was guessing. Nobody was pretending. The room felt strangely honest. Robert reviewed everything they knew. The timeline. The contracts. The meetings. The trust. Frank's involvement. Gregory's consulting firm. Then he stopped. Looked around the room. And asked a simple question. If Gregory stopped working for Frank? Silence. Who started paying him afterward? Nobody answered immediately. Because nobody knew. And yet everyone suddenly realized that was the most important question in the entire case. Not the farm. Not the trust. Not the guardianship discussions. The money. Follow the money. Harold remembered hearing that phrase years ago. He finally understood why people repeated it so often. Money doesn't always reveal motives. But it usually reveals direction. Late that afternoon, Robert received a call. The kind of call lawyers rarely enjoy receiving. Unexpected. Urgent. Private. He listened for nearly 10 minutes. Taking notes. As the conversation continued, his expression changed. Then changed again. By the time he ended the call, everyone in the room knew something significant had happened. What is it? Susan asked. Robert looked directly at Harold. The payments changed 6 months ago. Harold sat forward. Changed how? The original consulting invoices stopped. That didn't sound important. Until Robert continued. And a new entity started paying Gregory's group. Now everyone was listening carefully. A holding company. Mark frowned. What company? Robert looked down at his notes. Then read the name aloud. Harbor Ridge Capital. The room remained silent. Nobody recognized it. Not Mark. Not Susan. Not Harold. That alone was interesting. Because Harbor Ridge Capital had apparently spent hundreds of thousands of dollars influencing events around Harold's family. Yet none of them had ever heard of it. Which meant the company wasn't part of the family. And it wasn't operating openly. That evening, Harold sat on the porch watching the sun set. Again. The sunsets never stopped. No matter what happened. People fought. Families broke. Businesses failed. Lives changed. And still the sun crossed the horizon exactly as it always had. Diane used to love that. She said it reminded her not to panic. The world rarely moves as fast as our fears. Harold smiled slightly at the memory. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. Again. For a moment he considered ignoring it. Instead, he answered. Hello. The voice that responded wasn't Rebecca. It wasn't Gregory. It wasn't anyone Harold recognized. The speaker sounded older. Calm. Measured. Confident. The kind of confidence that comes from power. Mr. Bennett. Harold immediately felt his instincts sharpen. Who is this? A brief pause. Then. Someone who's trying to prevent a mistake. Harold had heard enough vague warnings lately to fill a book. What mistake? The voice answered without hesitation. You're focusing on the wrong asset. Harold looked toward the fields. The farm. The pond. The barn. Everything this story had revolved around. What asset should I be focused on? The answer arrived immediately. The voting rights. For several seconds Harold said nothing. Because the phrase made no sense. Voting rights? This wasn't a corporation. Or was it? The voice continued. Look at the trust amendments. Then the line went dead. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. Harold lowered the phone slowly. His heart was beating faster now. Not from fear. Recognition. Because he had felt this before. The feeling that arrives just before a hidden door opens. The next morning he and Robert reviewed every trust amendment again. Page by page. Line by line. Hour after hour. Then, buried deep inside an amendment Diane insisted on adding years earlier, they found it. A clause. Tiny. Almost invisible. Easy to ignore. Until you understood it. Harold read it once. Then twice. Then a third time. And suddenly everything changed. Because the trust didn't just control assets. It controlled voting authority inside several land partnerships. Partnerships connected to development rights. Infrastructure rights. Future expansion corridors. And the combined value of those rights was worth far more than the farm itself. Far more. The room became completely silent. Then Robert whispered. My God. Harold slowly leaned back in his chair. For months everyone had been staring at the farm. The property. The visible assets. Meanwhile the real prize had been hidden in legal paperwork almost nobody bothered reading. The farm wasn't the treasure. It was the map. And somewhere out there, the person truly behind all of this had known that from the very beginning. Harold didn't speak for nearly a minute. Neither did Robert. The trust documents remained spread across the conference table. Page after page. Clause after clause. Years of legal language hiding something nobody bothered to notice. Until now. Voting rights. Not ownership. Not inheritance. Voting rights. The distinction changed everything. Because ownership creates value. Control decides where that value goes. And whoever controlled those partnership votes could influence projects worth tens of millions of dollars. Perhaps more. Suddenly every strange event of the last several months looked different. The farm. The trust. The consultants. The urgency. The family meetings. The pressure. None of it had been random. It had all been moving toward one objective. Control. Harold stared at the paperwork. Then quietly laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because the irony was almost unbelievable. For weeks everyone treated him like an old farmer sitting on valuable land. In reality, the land wasn't the most valuable thing he possessed. The paperwork was. Late that afternoon, Robert's office received another visitor. Unexpected. Unannounced. Frank. The moment he entered the room, Harold knew something was wrong. Frank looked exhausted. More exhausted than before. The kind of exhaustion that comes from fear. Real fear. Not embarrassment. Not regret. Fear. I need to talk to you. Harold nodded. Robert closed the office door. Nobody sat immediately. Finally Frank spoke. They know you're getting close. The room became still. Harold felt his pulse quicken. Not because he was surprised. Because he expected it. Secrets become unstable when too many people know them. And lately a lot of people had started talking. What happened? Harold asked. Frank rubbed his face. Then answered. Gregory called me. That alone was unusual. According to Frank, they hadn't spoken directly in months. Not since their relationship deteriorated. Yet Gregory called anyway. Why? Because Gregory was nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. Frank explained that Gregory spent most of the conversation asking questions. Not answering them. Questions about Harold. Questions about Robert. Questions about who had access to certain documents. Questions about recent meetings. Questions about leaks. The word leaks caught Harold's attention immediately. Leaks. Plural. Meaning Gregory knew information was escaping. Meaning Gregory knew his operation wasn't secure anymore. Meaning somebody inside his circle was actively helping Harold. That realization changed the atmosphere instantly. Because for the first time, the advantage was shifting. Not completely, but noticeably. Then Frank revealed something else. Something much more important. Gregory wasn't trying to stop Harold. He was trying to accelerate the timeline. The room fell silent. Again. Acceleration. Another interesting word. People accelerate when they believe opportunities are disappearing. Or when danger is approaching. What timeline? Robert asked. Frank shook his head. I don't know exactly. Then he paused. I only know they're trying to finish before the quarterly partnership review. Harold and Robert exchanged a glance. The quarterly review. Of course. Voting rights. Partnership interests. Development corridors. Everything connected. For weeks they had been staring at separate pieces. Now the pieces were finally locking together. Then Frank said something that made Harold's stomach tighten. There's another meeting. Harold wasn't surprised. There always is. No. Frank looked directly at him. This one is different. Why? Because you're on the agenda. The room became completely silent. Not metaphorically. Actually silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally Harold asked. In what way? Frank hesitated. Then answered. They intend to present a recommendation. There was that word again. Recommendation. Professional language. Polite language. Dangerous language. Harold had learned to distrust it. Because recommendations become actions. Actions become realities. And realities become very difficult to reverse. What recommendation? Frank looked away. For the first time since arriving. Then quietly answered. A transition recommendation. The phrase landed heavily. Not because Harold didn't understand it. Because he did. A transition recommendation wasn't about the future. It was about authority. Decision-making. Control. Everything they had been discussing for months. Then Frank said something unexpected. Something that surprised even Robert. I brought copies. The room froze. Slowly, Frank reached into his briefcase. Removed a thick envelope. And placed it on the table. Nobody touched it immediately. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Because everyone understood what might be inside. Months of planning. Months of meetings. Months of hidden discussions. Finally Harold opened it. The first document appeared. Then another. Then another. Presentation outlines. Meeting summaries. Advisory recommendations. Internal memos. Page after page. The evidence they had been searching for. And buried halfway through the stack. Harold found a document stamped. Confidential. Below it sat a title. Only 7 words. 7 words that instantly explained the entire operation. Strategic acquisition through family representation. Harold stared at the page. Then slowly looked up. Because for the first time since receiving that cruise rejection text, he finally understood the truth. This had never been a family dispute. The family had merely been the doorway. The real objective had always been acquisition. And somebody, somewhere, had believed Harold Bennett would never live long enough. Or think clearly enough. To figure that out. Harold didn't open the rest of the envelope that night. Not because he wasn't curious. Because he was. Very. But after nearly 2 months of revelations, he had learned something important. The first emotional reaction is rarely the most useful one. Anger wants action. Shock wants conclusions. Neither helps much. So he waited. The documents remained on the kitchen table. The farmhouse remained quiet. The same farmhouse where Diane had spent 30 years teaching him patience. By sunrise, Harold felt calmer. Clearer. Ready. At 9 o'clock sharp, he sat down with Robert. The thick envelope lay between them. For nearly 3 hours, they reviewed every page. Every note. Every recommendation. Every internal memo. And the deeper they went, the uglier the picture became. Not because of criminal activity. There was very little that appeared illegal. That was the genius of it. Everything had been designed to look reasonable. Professional. Responsible. Defensible. The documents repeatedly used the same phrases. Future continuity. Risk reduction. Asset optimization. Stakeholder alignment. Transition planning. The language felt corporate. Cold. Calculated. The kind of language people use when discussing companies. Not families. Then Robert found something. A memo. Only 2 pages long. Easy to overlook. At the top was a heading. Projected obstacle analysis. Harold frowned. Obstacle. Interesting choice of word. The document listed several potential challenges. Family disagreement. Public perception. Regulatory review. Unexpected legal resistance. Then Harold saw his own name. Beside it was a short assessment. Harold Bennett. High emotional attachment. Low probability of voluntary participation. Recommended approach. Leverage trusted family relationships. The room became silent. Harold stared at the page. Not because he felt insulted. Because he felt sad. For weeks he had been asking himself. Why involve the family? Now he had his answer. The family wasn't the target. The family was the tool. The realization hurt more than any financial threat ever could. Robert continued reading. A few pages later he stopped again. This time his reaction was stronger. Much stronger. What is it? Robert turned the document around. At the bottom of the page sat a projected timeline. Several milestones. Several deadlines. Several objectives. And one item highlighted in bold. Secure representative approval before quarterly review. Harold immediately understood. Representative approval. Not ownership. Not acquisition. Authority. Someone wanted a family representative to approve actions on his behalf. Someone wanted a shortcut. The farm. The trust. The voting rights. Everything connected. Then Robert pointed to another line. A line nobody had noticed before. Projected representative. M. Bennett. Mark. Harold leaned back slowly. For several seconds he said nothing. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not a happy smile. Not an angry smile. A knowing smile. Because suddenly everything made sense. Mark wasn't the architect. He wasn't even the beneficiary. He was the bridge. The person Gregory intended to use. The person everyone expected to sign. The person everyone expected to trust the process. And judging by the events of the last week, that bridge had collapsed. Late that afternoon, Mark arrived. Harold handed him the document. Said nothing. Simply watched him read. The silence lasted almost 10 minutes. By the end, Mark looked sick. Actually sick. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Sick. Because for the first time he saw himself exactly as Gregory saw him. Not as a partner. Not as family. As a resource. A means to an end. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hollow. I never agreed to this. Harold believed him. The document proved it. Gregory never needed Mark's agreement. He only needed Mark's cooperation. There is a difference. A very important difference. For several minutes neither man spoke. Then Mark said something that changed everything. I know where the final meeting is. Harold looked up. The final meeting? Mark nodded. The one before the quarterly review. Robert immediately sat forward. Every instinct in the room sharpened. Because after months of following clues, they had finally reached the point where plans become actions. Who's attending? Mark listed several names. Gregory. Consultants. Investors. Advisors. Then he mentioned one final name. A name that instantly caught Robert's attention. Not because he recognized it. Because he didn't. And according to Robert, that was impossible. The name belonged to the person who controlled Harbor Ridge Capital. The company funding everything. The company behind Gregory. The company behind the strategy. The company behind the pressure. For months that person's identity had remained hidden. Now, for the first time, they knew where he would be. And in 3 days. Harold Bennett intended to meet him face to face. 3 days passed quickly. Too quickly. For weeks, Harold had been chasing answers. Now the answers were waiting in a room across town. And somehow that felt worse. The final meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. A private conference suite inside a hotel overlooking downtown Indianapolis. Neutral territory. Professional territory. The kind of place people choose when they want important decisions to feel official. Harold spent most of Wednesday doing nothing. At least outwardly. Inside, his mind never stopped. He thought about Diane. About Mark. About Susan. About all the ordinary family moments that now seemed connected to something much larger. By Thursday morning, he felt strangely calm. Not confident. Not nervous. Resolved. There comes a point in every conflict where fear loses its power. Not because the danger disappears. Because uncertainty disappears. Harold had reached that point. At 1 o'clock, he entered the hotel with Robert. Mark arrived separately. Susan wasn't there. They all agreed she shouldn't be. She had already risked enough. The conference floor occupied the top level of the building. Quiet. Private. Expensive. As Harold stepped from the elevator, he immediately noticed Gregory Dalton. Standing near a window. Talking with 2 consultants. Confident. Relaxed. The same man who had spent months orchestrating meetings and presentations. For a brief moment, Gregory froze. Only a moment. Then the smile returned. Professional. Controlled. Practiced. But Harold had seen it. The surprise. The discomfort. The realization that something had changed. Gregory approached. Mr. Bennett. Harold nodded politely. Nothing more. No anger. No accusations. No dramatic confrontation. That seemed to bother Gregory more than outrage would have. Because calm people are difficult to predict. Several attendees turned to look. Whispers spread quietly through the room. Not everyone expected Harold to appear. That much was obvious. Then Harold noticed something else. Several faces looked relieved. Not nervous. Relieved. The anonymous messages suddenly made more sense. Some people in this room had wanted him here. Wanted the truth exposed. Wanted somebody to challenge what had been happening. Then the door opened. And the room changed. A man entered. Mid-60s. Silver hair. Perfect suit. The kind of confidence money often creates. He didn't rush. Didn't look around. Didn't need attention. People naturally watched him anyway. The room subtly adjusted itself around him. Conversations paused. Postures changed. Gregory immediately walked over. That told Harold everything. This was the person. Not Gregory. Not Frank. Not Victoria Mercer. This man. The real client. The real decision maker. The real source of power behind Harbor Ridge Capital. For several seconds Harold simply observed. Then Robert quietly leaned toward him. That's Daniel Mercer. Harold frowned. Mercer? Robert nodded. The founder. The name clicked immediately. Victoria Mercer. Daniel Mercer. Suddenly another piece fell into place. Not husband and wife. Not siblings. Father and daughter. The connection explained a lot. The meeting began shortly afterward. People took seats around a long conference table. Harold noticed something interesting. No one asked him to leave. No one objected. No one challenged his presence. Because removing him now would create questions. Questions nobody wanted. Gregory started the presentation. The same polished language. The same professional tone. The same charts. The same recommendations. Harold listened quietly. For nearly 40 minutes. Until Gregory reached the final section. Recommended transition structure. There it was. The destination. The reason for everything. The reason for the meetings. The assessments. The pressure. The influence campaign. Everything. Then Gregory invited questions. Nobody spoke. The room remained silent. Finally Harold raised his hand. The gesture felt almost absurd. Like a student asking permission. Yet every eye in the room turned toward him. Gregory forced a smile. Of course, Mr. Bennett. Harold stood slowly. Not dramatically. Simply stood. Then he placed a folder on the conference table. The thick envelope Frank had delivered. The room immediately became uncomfortable. Several faces changed color. Several others stopped taking notes. Because they recognized the documents. They knew exactly what Harold possessed. And more importantly, they knew he wasn't supposed to possess them. Harold looked around the room. One face at a time. Then he spoke. Calmly. Clearly. Without raising his voice. I have a question. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Harold continued. If this process is really about protecting my interests. He opened the folder. Spread several documents across the table. Why does it contain a document called Strategic Acquisition through Family Representation? The silence that followed was unlike any silence Harold had experienced before. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Dangerous. Because for the first time since this story began, the people who had spent months asking questions were the ones being forced to answer them. Nobody answered immediately. Not Gregory. Not Daniel Mercer. Not a single person in the room. Because Harold's question wasn't really a question. It was evidence. And everyone knew it. Gregory recovered first. People like Gregory always do. He adjusted his jacket. Smiled politely. Then stepped forward. Mr. Bennett, I think you're misunderstanding the document. Of course. Harold almost expected it. The first defense is always misunderstanding. The second is context. The third is blame. He had seen the pattern many times in business. Gregory continued. The phrase acquisition refers to opportunities, not individuals. A few people around the table nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Harold noticed. Because uncomfortable people often know more than they wish they did. Without speaking, Harold slid another document across the table. This one contained internal notes. Gregory's smile faded slightly. Not much. Just enough. The notes contained language Gregory couldn't easily explain away. Projected family resistance. Influence pathway. Representative leverage. Stakeholder management. The room grew quieter. Much quieter. For the first time, Daniel Mercer looked directly at the documents. Not at Harold. At the documents. That interested Harold. Because powerful people usually study risk before they study people. Then Robert stood. Nobody had expected that. Not even Gregory. The attorney calmly distributed several copies around the room. One by one. Page after page. Payment records. Contracts. Timelines. Communication summaries. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just facts. Facts have a strange effect on rooms like this. They remove oxygen. The confidence Gregory had carried all afternoon began fading. Slowly. Then faster. Questions started appearing. Not from Harold. From other attendees. When was this prepared? Why wasn't this disclosed? Who authorized this recommendation? Why wasn't Mr. Bennett included? One after another. The questions came faster. And for the first time, Gregory found himself defending instead of presenting. A dangerous position. Especially when confidence is your primary asset. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel Mercer raised his hand. The room immediately fell silent. Not because he demanded attention. Because everyone was used to giving it to him. He spoke calmly. Measured. Controlled. Gregory. The consultant turned. Did you disclose these materials to me? The question hit harder than any accusation. Because it wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Professional. Deadly. Gregory hesitated. Only briefly. But it was enough. Harold saw it. Robert saw it. Everyone saw it. The hesitation told the story. Daniel's expression hardened. Just slightly. The kind of subtle change that experienced businessmen recognize instantly. Trust evaporating. Confidence disappearing. Distance forming. Then Daniel asked another question. A worse question. Did you represent this initiative as having family support? Silence. Gregory opened his mouth. Closed it again. Then attempted an answer. A complicated answer. The kind people give when simple answers no longer help them. Halfway through the explanation, Daniel raised a hand. Stopping him. The room became completely still. Because everyone understood something important. Gregory Dalton had just lost the room. Not all at once. Piece by piece. But enough. Enough to matter. Then Mark stood. Harold hadn't expected it. Neither had anyone else. His son looked nervous. Terrified, actually. Yet he remained standing. For several seconds he struggled to find words. Then he finally spoke. I need to say something. The room turned toward him. Mark swallowed hard. Then continued. I participated in some of these meetings. Harold felt his chest tighten. Not from fear. From uncertainty. He didn't know where this was going. Neither did anyone else. Mark took a breath. Then another. And finally said the words Harold had waited months to hear. I was wrong. The room remained silent. No excuses. No qualifications. No explanations. Just. I was wrong. Mark looked toward his father. For a moment, he looked like a little boy again. Not the executive. Not the decision-maker. Just a son. I thought I was protecting the future. His voice cracked slightly. I never realized I was helping strangers take control of it. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Because every person in that room understood something. The battle had just changed. This was no longer about documents. Or voting rights. Or trust structures. It was about trust itself. The human kind. And once that breaks, no consultant in the world can repair it with a presentation. Then Mark turned toward Daniel Mercer. And said the sentence that ended Gregory Dalton's influence forever. If Mr. Bennett wasn't fully informed. Another breath. Then none of us were. The silence that followed was absolute. Because in one sentence, Mark had destroyed the foundation of the entire recommendation. And everybody in the room knew it. Nobody spoke. Not for several seconds. The room had reached a point where every person understood the same thing. The recommendation was dead. Not weakened. Dead. Because the one thing Gregory needed most was legitimacy. And Mark had just taken it away. Harold looked at his son. For the first time in months, he saw something he hadn't seen in a very long time. Courage. Not confidence. Not certainty. Courage. The willingness to admit a mistake in front of a room full of people. That mattered. More than Mark realized. Across the table, Gregory seemed to understand it too. His posture had changed. The easy confidence was gone. The rehearsed charm was gone. Now he looked like a man trying to calculate exits. Daniel Mercer noticed. So did everyone else. Then Daniel slowly closed the folder in front of him. The sound echoed through the room. A small sound. A very important sound. Because it meant the meeting was over. At least for him. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice remained calm. Professional. Measured. But there was no warmth left in it. Mr. Dalton. Gregory looked up. I believe this engagement is concluded. No shouting. No threats. No drama. Just 7 words. Years of business had taught Harold something. The most powerful people rarely raise their voices. They simply make decisions. And Gregory immediately understood what had happened. The project was over. His influence was over. His access was over. Most importantly, his funding was over. Nobody rushed to defend him. Not one person. That alone said everything. The room slowly began emptying. People gathered papers. Collected laptops. Avoided eye contact. Several attendees approached Harold quietly. One by one. Offering apologies. Explanations. Regrets. Most sounded sincere. Some didn't. Harold listened politely. Accepted none of it personally. Because the truth was simple. By the time people apologize, the damage already exists. Then Daniel Mercer approached. The two men stood face to face. For a moment neither spoke. Finally Daniel extended his hand. Harold shook it. The gesture surprised both of them. Daniel nodded toward the documents. I wasn't given the full picture. Harold believed him. Not completely. But enough. The man looked irritated. Not embarrassed. Not guilty. Irritated. Investors hate surprises. Especially expensive surprises. Daniel glanced toward Gregory, who was now standing alone near the back of the room. Then looked back at Harold. For what it's worth. A brief pause. I think your family was manipulated. Harold considered the statement. Then answered honestly. No. Daniel waited. Harold continued. My family allowed themselves to be manipulated. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because responsibility matters. Without it, nobody learns anything. Daniel nodded slowly. Almost respectfully. Then left. Just like that. The mysterious figure behind Harbor Ridge Capital. The man everyone feared. Gone. No dramatic showdown. No final speech. Just a businessman walking away from a bad investment. And somehow that felt more realistic than anything else. An hour later, Harold found himself standing outside the hotel. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass buildings. Traffic moved through downtown Indianapolis. Life continued. As it always does. Mark stood beside him. Neither man spoke for a while. Eventually Mark broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Harold looked at him. The words sounded different now. Not because they were new. Because they were earned. Weeks earlier, an apology would have been easy. Now it cost something. Now it meant something. Harold nodded. "I know." Mark looked surprised. "You do?" "I do." Silence returned. Then Harold said something he had been thinking about for days. "Your mother would have been furious." For a second, Mark laughed. Then so did Harold. The first genuine laugh either of them had shared in months. The tension eased. Not disappeared. Eased. Healing rarely happens all at once. That evening, Harold returned to the farm. The same driveway. The same barn. The same pond. The same house. Yet everything felt different. Not because he had one. Because he finally understood. The farm was never the point. The trust was never the point. The voting rights were never the point. Not really. The real battle had always been about something much simpler. Whether people still saw him as a person. Or merely as an obstacle standing between them and what they wanted. As the sun began setting, another truck pulled into the driveway. Susan. A few minutes later, Mark arrived. Then the grandchildren. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had organized it. They simply came. The way families are supposed to. Harold stood on the porch watching them gather. Listening to voices drift across the yard. Watching the grandchildren run toward the pond. For the first time since Diane's death, the property felt alive again. Not valuable. Alive. Susan walked up beside him. Quietly. Just like her mother used to. For a while they watched in silence. Then she asked. "Do you think it's finally over?" Harold looked across the fields. The evening light stretched across the land Diane loved. The land everyone had spent months fighting over. The land that suddenly seemed less important than the people standing on it. Finally he smiled. A small smile. The kind that comes with age. The kind that comes with perspective. And he answered. "The paperwork is over." Susan nodded. "And the rest?" Harold watched Mark helping one of the grandchildren untangle a fishing line near the pond. Then he looked toward the sunset. "The rest." A longer pause. "Is up to us." A year later, very little looked different from the road. The white fence still followed the edge of the property. The pond still reflected the evening sky. The barn still leaned slightly to one side, just as it had for years. Most people driving past would never have guessed what happened there. That seemed fitting. The biggest battles in life rarely leave visible scars. Harold still lived in the same farmhouse. Still drank coffee on the porch every morning. Still complained about the weather. Still argued with the tractor when it refused to start. In many ways, life returned to normal. But not exactly. Because normal wasn't what Harold wanted anymore. He wanted better. And little by little, that was exactly what happened. Mark started visiting almost every weekend. Not out of guilt. At least not anymore. At first, guilt brought him there. Then habit. Then love. The healthiest things often begin imperfectly. Susan visited more often too. Sometimes with the grandchildren. Sometimes alone. Sometimes for no reason at all. Those became Harold's favorite visits. No emergencies. No paperwork. No discussions about trusts. Just family. One afternoon, nearly 14 months after the final meeting, Harold found himself sitting beside the pond with Emma. She was 16 now. Older. Wiser. Still wonderfully incapable of hiding what she thought. The fishing line rested quietly on the water. Neither had caught anything. Neither seemed to care. Emma broke the silence first. "Grandpa?" "Yeah? Why didn't you sell?" Harold smiled. The question eventually reaches everyone. The farm. The land. The money. People always ask. "What makes you think I should have?" She shrugged. "Because it would have been easier." Harold looked across the water. The answer came immediately. Because he had spent a year thinking about it. No. Emma looked confused. No. It would have been simpler. He smiled. Not easier. The distinction made her think. That pleased him. Diane always said good answers should make people think. Not just agree. The two sat quietly for a while. Then Harold said something he had never told anyone. Not Mark. Not Susan. Not even Robert. "You know what the funniest part is?" Emma shook her head. For months everybody thought they were fighting over the farm. She laughed. "Yeah." Harold nodded. They were wrong. Emma waited. What were they really fighting over? Harold looked toward the farmhouse. Toward the porch. Toward the kitchen window glowing in the distance. Then toward his family. Mark was helping one of the younger kids untangle a fishing rod. Susan stood near the garden talking to her daughter. Voices drifted through the evening air. Ordinary voices. Beautiful voices. The right to belong here. Emma frowned. At first she didn't understand. Then slowly she did. Because land isn't just dirt. A home isn't just wood. A family isn't just blood. They are stories. Memories. Years shared together. People fight over property when they think property is the treasure. Age teaches a different lesson. The treasure is usually everything surrounding it. As the sun began sinking below the trees, Harold found himself thinking about Diane again. Not with sadness. Not anymore. With gratitude. There is a difference. He remembered something she once told him after a difficult year in their marriage. A year when money was tight. The children were young. And everything felt uncertain. She had said, "One day we'll discover what really matters." At the time Harold assumed she meant money. Or security. Or success. Now he understood. She meant people. She always meant people. The following spring, Harold made a change. Not because lawyers advised it. Not because consultants recommended it. Because he wanted to. He rewrote portions of the trust. Simplified everything. Made his intentions impossible to misunderstand. Then he gathered the family together. Not in a conference room. Not in a hotel. At the farmhouse. Around a long wooden table. The way families are supposed to meet. When he finished explaining everything, nobody argued. Nobody negotiated. Nobody asked about percentages. Nobody asked about voting rights. The silence that followed was one of the proudest moments of Harold's life. Because everyone finally understood the same thing. The trust wasn't protecting money. It was protecting relationships. The paperwork existed so the family could stay a family. Not become a business transaction. Years later, after Harold was gone, people in town would occasionally tell stories about him. Some remembered the farm. Some remembered the business. Some remembered the land dispute that never became a dispute. But the people who knew him best remembered something else. They remembered the way he sat on the porch at sunset. Coffee in hand. Grandchildren nearby. Watching the fields turn gold. Perfectly content. Not because life had gone according to plan. It hadn't. Not even close. But because he learned something many people never do. Winning isn't keeping everything. Winning is knowing what truly matters before it's too late. And if Harold Bennett had one final lesson to leave behind, it might be this. Be careful when people tell you they're protecting your future. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they aren't. But the people who genuinely love you don't need complicated presentations. They don't need strategies. They don't need influence campaigns. They don't need hidden agendas. They show up. They tell the truth. And when they make mistakes, they find their way back. The farm remained. The pond remained. The family remained. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. Eleanor Brooks, from a quiet little town outside Indianapolis.